Some places don't hide their secrets. They bury them so deep that even the mind begins to doubt itself. Tonight, you step into Shutter Island, Dennis Lehane's haunting psychological thriller, a story born from an unsettling dream and the author's fascination with memory, grief, and the fragile line between truth and illusion. When the novel was published in 2003, it captivated readers around the world, selling millions of copies and cementing Lehane's place among modern masters of suspense, alongside acclaimed works like Mystic River and Gone Baby Gone. Its shadowy power reached even further when it became the 2010 film adaptation directed by Martin Scorsese. As you listen, remember that this is a third-person retelling of the story, not a word-for-word reading, and while the visuals in this video are created using today's technology, they may not always perfectly match every scene from the story, but they are designed to help you visualize the world and atmosphere as you listen. Along the way, you'll also discover fascinating facts, adaptation trivia, and behind-the-scenes details that make this story even more unforgettable. The story begins. The aging psychiatrist sat at his desk, his gaze turned inward, across the decades. It had been years since he'd last seen the island, and even then, it was only a distant hazy shape from a friend's boat, a smudge of gray and green against the summer sky, barely there. He hadn't set foot on its shores in over 20 years, but Emily, his wife, often said half in jest, he suspected that he'd never truly left. She had a way of putting things, and she once told him that time for him was nothing more than a collection of bookmarks. He used them to leap back and forth through the story of his own life, returning obsessively to the same traumatic chapters. His more observant colleagues, she pointed out, saw in this a classic melancholics pattern. He couldn't argue. Emily was rarely wrong. The thought was a fresh wound. He was going to lose her soon. Dr. Axelrod had given them the news just days ago, a matter of months. The advice was to take that trip they'd always talked about, to Florence, Rome, Venice in the spring. It was a gentle push, and Axelrod's concern was palpable. He'd added that Lester himself wasn't looking well. He knew it was true. His mind was starting to betray him. He misplaced his glasses constantly, his car keys, wandered into stores and forgot what he needed, left a theater unable to recall what he'd just watched. If his life was a book held together by bookmarks, then it felt as if someone had given it a good shake. All those yellowed slips of paper, the torn matchbook covers, and flattened coffee stirrers that marked his most important memories, had been scattered on the floor. The dog-eared pages had been pressed flat and smooth, the landmarks of his past erased. He needed to write it all down, not to cast himself in a better light. That would have been an offense to the man who was the subject of this story. That man, in his own peculiar way, had hated lies more than anyone he'd ever known. He simply wanted to preserve the text, to move it from the failing storage of his memory to these pages, while he still could. He remembered the hospital as it sat, benign and almost pleasant on the island's central plain. It looked nothing like an asylum for the criminally insane, and even less like the military barracks it had once been. To most of them, it resembled a boarding school. The warden lived in a mansarded Victorian just outside the main compound, while the chief of staff had quarters in a dark, beautiful Tudor mini-castle that had once housed a Union commander. Inside the wall, the staff lived in quaint clapboard cottages and simple cinder-block dormitories. The grounds themselves were a study in contrasts, manicured lawns and sculpted hedges, great shady oaks and Scotch pines, all centered around twin red brick colonials and the main hospital building of charcoal stone. Beyond that, the land gave way to bluffs, tidal marsh, and a long valley where an old collective farm had failed. The fruit trees they'd planted still stood, barren and skeletal, their branches howling in the night wind. And then there was the fort, older than all of it, jutting out from the southern cliff face. And beyond that, the lighthouse, silent and obsolete since before the Civil War. From the sea, The island seemed almost an afterthought, a scrub plane barely holding on to its existence. He pictured how it must have looked to Teddy Daniels on that clear September morning in 1954, a desolate, purposeless rock. The rats were the dominant life form. They scurried through the brush, lined the shore at night, clambered over the wet rocks, some as large as flounder. In the years after those strange 4 days, he'd taken to watching them from a cut in the hill overlooking the northern shore. He'd become fascinated by the ones who tried to swim for Paddock Island, a tiny rock that remained submerged most of the day. For an hour or two at low tide, when the sand appeared, the rats would make their desperate attempt, always driven back by the riptide. He said always, but that wasn't true. He saw one make it once, a harvest moon in October of '56, a black body like a fat moccasin darting across the pearl-gray sand. Emily would doubt him. Of course she'd say it was too far away to see clearly. She was right. And yet, he knew what he saw. He watched it scurry up the shore before the returning tide swallowed the island whole, taking the rat with it. He never saw it swim back. In that moment, watching it, he'd thought of Teddy, of his poor dead wife Dolores Chenal, and of the twin terrors, Rachel Solando and Andrew Lettuce, and the havoc they had all wreaked. If Teddy had been sitting with him, he was certain he would have seen that rat too. He was certain of it. And more than that, Teddy would have clapped for it. Teddy Daniels's father had been a fisherman, a man who lost his boat to the bank when Teddy was just 11 years old. After that, he spent the rest of his life hiring on to other vessels when work was available, or unloading freight along the docks when it wasn't. There were long, quiet stretches when he'd be back home by mid-morning, sitting in his armchair, staring at his hands, occasionally whispering to himself, his eyes wide and dark with some private despair. He'd taken Teddy out among the islands once, when the boy was very small, far too young to be of any real use. The only tasks Teddy could manage were untangling the lines and tying off the hooks, a job that left his fingertips dotted with blood and his palms smeared with it. They had set out in the dark, and when the sun finally rose, it was a cold, pale ivory pushing up from the sea's edge. The islands materialized out of the fading dusk, huddled together, as if they'd been caught doing something they shouldn't. Teddy spotted small pastel shacks on one, a crumbling limestone estate on another. His father pointed out the prison on Deer Island and the stately fort on George. On Thompson, the trees were thick with birds, their cries chattering like hail and breaking glass. And then there was Shutter, lying further out, like something discarded from a Spanish galleon. In the spring of '28, it was wild and abandoned, its fort strangled in vines and topped with great clouds of moss. He'd asked his father why it was called Shutter, getting only a shrug in return and a comment about his endless questions. Some places just got a name that stuck, his father said, probably pirates. Teddy loved the thought of that, imagining big men with eye patches and gleaming swords. His father confirmed it, saying the islands were where pirates had hidden in the old days, hiding themselves and their gold. Teddy could picture it clearly, chests of it, with coins spilling down the sides. Later, he got violently sick, pitching black ropes of it over the side of the boat. His father was surprised, as Teddy hadn't started vomiting until hours into the trip, when the ocean was flat and calm. He comforted the boy, telling him it was okay, that it was his first time, that there was nothing to be ashamed of. He explained that sometimes you couldn't feel the motion until it was already inside you. Teddy nodded, but couldn't tell his father the truth. It wasn't the motion at all, it was the water itself. It was stretched out around them until it was all that was left of the world. He believed it could swallow the sky. He'd never known they were this alone. His father told him he'd be okay, and Teddy tried his best to smile. His father went out on a Boston whaler in the summer of '38 and never returned. The next spring, pieces of the boat washed up on Nantasket Beach in Hull, a strip of keel, a hot plate with the captain's name etched in it, a few cans of soup, a couple of misshapen lobster traps. The funeral for the 4 fishermen was held in St. Teresa's Church, a building with its back pressed against the sea that had taken so many of its parishioners. Teddy stood with his mother, and listened as people gave testimonials. One of the old salts had been a terror in the local bars, but even his enemies were willing to forgive him in death. The boat's owner admitted he'd barely known Teddy's father, who had signed on at the last minute. Still, the captain had spoken highly of him. Everyone knew he could do a day's work. Standing in that church, Teddy remembered that day on his father's boat, because they'd never gone out again. His father kept saying they would, but Teddy understood it was just words, a way to hold on to some pride. His father never acknowledged what had happened that day, but a look had passed between them as they headed home, back through the string of islands. Shutter was behind them. Thompson still ahead, the city skyline so clear and close you could almost touch it. His father said that some men took to the sea, and some men were taken by it. He looked at Teddy in a way that made it clear which kind of man his son was destined to be. Now in 1954, Teddy was on a ferry making its way to that same island. The crossing took them past a collection of other forgotten islands, Thompson and Spectacle, Grape and Bumpkin, their sands and rocks white as bone. The ferry itself was a utilitarian vessel, stripped of all but the bare essentials. Its galley was little more than a metal floor, and 2 steel benches bolted under the windows, with manacles and their chains hanging in heavy coils from black posts at either end. Today, it wasn't transporting patients, just Teddy, his new partner, and a few bags of mail and supplies. Almost immediately, Teddy was on his knees in the head, heaving into the toilet. The engine chugged and clacked, and the air was thick with the oily smell of gasoline in the late summer sea. His throat constricted, his stomach banged against his esophagus, and the world in front of his face spun with motes that blinked like eyes. Nothing came out but small streams of water, but his body didn't care. The final heave was followed by a globe of trapped oxygen that seemed to rip a piece of his chest with it as it escaped. He sat back on the metal floor, wiping his face, and grimly reflected that this was not the way to start a new partnership. He could already imagine his new partner, Chuck, telling someone about the legendary Teddy Daniels and his dramatic introduction to seasickness. Since that trip as a boy, Teddy had never enjoyed being on the water. He hated the lack of land, the feeling of having nothing to reach out and touch. Even in the war, it wasn't the storming of the beaches that got him. It was those last few yards from the boats to the shore, slogging through the depths, feeling strange things slither past his boots. Still, he preferred the fresh air of the deck to the lurching warmth of the head. When his stomach finally settled, he washed up and checked his face in a salt-eroded mirror. He saw a still relatively young man with a crew cut, but his face was already lined with the evidence of war and years of a hard pursuing life. His eyes had a quality his late wife, Dolores, had once called dog-sad. He thought he was too young to look so hard. He adjusted his gear, fixed his hat, and tightened the knot in his loud floral tie. It was a gift from Dolores, and he wore it for her memory. He could still close his eyes and picture her, though lately, white smudges were beginning to obscure the details. Time was grinding away at the picture frames in his head, and he feared it was slowly taking her from him. He said her name aloud, a quiet admission of his loneliness, and went out onto the foredeck. The day was warm and clear, but the water was dark and threaded with rust, hinting at something massing in the depths. His new partner, Chuck, offered him a sip from a flask Teddy declined. He insisted he was fine, just finding his sea legs, though he knew that wasn't entirely true. He could feel the familiar dread stirring in his stomach, the same dread he'd felt as a boy looking out at that vast, empty water. The sea was waiting, and he was its prisoner. The 2 men stood in a comfortable silence, the sea rolling around them in dark, silken swells. Teddy broke the quiet to share a piece of local history, mentioning that the island had once been a peacock during the Civil War. Chuck was curious about the old fort's current use, but Teddy could only shrug. He knew there were several out here, most of them used for artillery practice, and not many left standing. As for the institution itself, he believed they'd repurposed the old troop quarters. Chuck grimaced at the thought, comparing it to going back to basic training, a prospect Teddy quickly dismissed. Turning the conversation, Teddy asked about Chuck's story. His new partner, a stocky man with tight, curly black hair and a small scythe-like scar on his cheek, explained the scar's origin not from war, but from a childhood slingshot fight, a piece of bark kicked up by a near miss that had left its mark. He was from Seattle, had transferred in just last week, and had been with the Marshals for 4 years. Teddy knew the service was small, and that everyone would eventually hear the scuttlebutt. Chuck admitted the transfer was due to his relationship with a Japanese-American woman. The lingering tensions in the Northwest made his life difficult. The conversation shifted to Teddy's legendary capture of a killer named Breck. When all the other agents had gone to Cleveland, Teddy had gone to Maine, following a lead from a relative who remembered Breck's happiest days at a horse farm. He'd shot the man 5 times and confirmed it took exactly that many to bring him down. Chuck, in turn, revealed the personal prejudice that had driven him out of his home district. Chuck then mentioned the storm they were sailing toward, the papers calling it something huge. Teddy, dismissive, reminded him of how unreliable weather reports had been during the war. Chuck, with a wry smile, acknowledged that while the stakes were higher overseas, back home there was no harm in a little arbitrary faith. Teddy found himself liking the man's easy, dime-novel way of talking. As the ferry churned closer, the island began to define itself, colors filling in like brushstrokes on a canvas, the shapes of buildings becoming visible. Chuck mused on the price of progress, predicting that places like this would one day be considered barbaric and assimilated into a new, more inclusive society. Teddy, however, was more interested in the immediate mystery of the island's geography, trying to make out the fort and the hospital beyond the bluffs. Chuck asked if Teddy was married. The answer was a quiet, heavy was. His wife was dead. Chuck was immediately apologetic, his face flushing with embarrassment. Teddy, trying to ease the tension, insisted it was okay. He could see her clearly in his mind's eye. A memory of her on their honeymoon, the way she'd turned her head, and the muscles moved under her skin. But the image was a painful reminder of what he'd lost. He wasn't ready to talk about it, but he knew the question was inevitable. For now, he simply stood at the rail, the wind in his face, trying to hold on to the image of his wife before it faded completely. Chuck raised a hand, apologizing for his lapse. He'd heard about Teddy's loss but had somehow forgotten, and he felt like an idiot. Teddy just nodded, the familiar weariness settling into his bones as he saw her again in his mind's eye, her back to him as she walked down the hallway of their apartment, wearing one of his old uniform shirts, humming as she turned into the kitchen. He would rather do anything swim in the cold water below, even than talk about her, about the fact that she had been there one morning and gone by the afternoon. But he knew it was like Chuck's scar, a story that had to be dispensed with so they could move on. She'd been dead for 2 years, but she came to him in dreams, and sometimes he'd wake and think she was still there, out in the kitchen or on the stoop. It was a cruel trick of the mind, but he'd accepted its logic. Waking was like being born. You surfaced without history, then had to reassemble the shards of your past. What was far crueler were the triggers: a salt shaker, a stranger's gate, a bottle of Coca-Cola, a smudge of lipstick. But the most potent trigger, and the most illogical, was water. It was everywhere around them now, spread for miles. He explained the fire in their apartment building, how she'd died from the smoke, not the flames, and that mattered to him. He'd quit drinking after, a promise to her, and now he carried the weight as best he could, just like he carried the shit he'd seen in the war. Chuck listened, his face flushing with embarrassment, and eventually agreed that was just what you did. The dock appeared in the distance, insubstantial and gray, and Teddy felt a dull ache pressing behind his eye, possibly dehydration, maybe the beginnings of a migraine, those old enemies that attacked only when the pressure was off. The trick he'd learned was to keep moving. He asked Chuck what he knew about the place, and Chuck admitted it was just a mental hospital. Teddy corrected him for the criminally insane. They traded a few jokes about their own stability, and as the ferry backed toward the dock, Teddy mentioned that the institution specialized in radical approaches, not red, just radical. Chuck noted the distinction was lost on most people lately. The conversation turned to the escaped woman. Teddy didn't know much. She'd slipped out last night. Chuck looked around at the water, wondering where she could possibly go. She couldn't swim home. Teddy explained that the patients here were truly crazy, not just the usual run-of-the-mill cases. Chuck wondered how many of them were faking it, like the Section 8s he'd seen in the war. Teddy shared a story about a soldier in the Ardennes who'd woken up speaking backward, then later scratched out his own eyes. Years later, the guy was still in the hospital, paralyzed, convinced he was a farmer. Chuck noted that a guy from Brooklyn thinking he was a farmer was a pretty good tip-off that he was nuts. A young deputy warden named McPherson met them at the dock, his lanky grace and slightly long blonde hair marking him as a Texan or someone who'd grown up around horses. He was flanked by a pack of orderlies in white, mostly Negroes, who moved with deadened efficiency, barely glancing at the marshals as they unloaded the ferry's cargo. Teddy and Chuck produced their badges, and McPherson studied them with deliberate slowness, commenting that he'd never seen a U.S. Marshal's badge before. Chuck quipped that now he'd seen two, and McPherson responded with a lazy grin before flipping the badge back. The beach was strewn with the sea's debris shells, driftwood, skeletons of mollusks, and the remains of fish. Trash from the inner harbor had washed up, and Teddy spotted a single license plate bleached beige by the sun. The trees were thin and haggard, and through the gaps he could see buildings on the rise. He thought of Dolores, who would have loved the sun, but all he felt was the ocean breeze, a constant warning from the sea. The orderlies loaded mail and medical cases onto handcarts, and McPherson signed off. The ferry guard mentioned the storm, anxious to leave. Teddy assured him they'd contact the station when they needed pickup, and Chuck waved off the guard's concerns. McPherson led them up a path through the trees to a paved road. They passed a maroon mansarded Victorian on the left and a Tudor on the right, the latter commanding its rise like a castle. They climbed a steep slope through seagrass, until the land leveled out into a manicured lawn stretching to a 10-foot orange brick wall, topped with a single strip of wire. The sight of that wire struck Teddy with a sudden pity for the people on the other side, who understood how badly the world wanted to keep them in. Chuck commented on the strange sight of correctional guards at a mental institution. McPherson explained it was a maximum security facility operating under dual charters. Chuck joked about what they'd talk about around the dinner table, and McPherson just shook his head with a small smile. Teddy noticed a man in a guard's uniform accented with yellow epaulets, his bearing that of a full colonel from the war, a small black book pressed to his ribcage. McPherson identified him as the warden, whom they'd meet later. Teddy wondered why not now, as the man disappeared over the rise. At the gate, the orderlies unlocked it and proceeded inside. McPherson turned all business, laying out the rules they'd be given all courtesies and help, but they'd have to obey protocol. Unmonitored contact with patients was forbidden. Ward A was the male ward, Ward B the female, and Ward C was off limits without written consent from both the warden and Dr. Cawley. Then came the request to surrender their firearms. Teddy argued they were required to carry them, but McPherson cited a federal exception. Reluctantly, Teddy agreed, noting their objections for the record. He unholstered his service revolver, snapped the cylinder open, and handed it over. Chuck fumbled with his, slower and more awkward, but McPherson waited without impatience. Their weapons would be checked into the property room and returned on their departure. With the official business done, McPherson's cowboy grin returned, and he led them through the gate which closed behind them. Inside, the grounds were beautifully maintained, with manacled gardeners tending to trees, flower beds, and rose bushes. Other patients, mostly men, walked with odd duck-like steps, flanked by orderlies. McPherson noted how different it was from the seagrass, and scrubbed the first clinicians had found. The twin red brick colonials stood on either side of the main hospital, their windows barred and yellowed by salt spray. The hospital itself was a charcoal-colored structure of sea-smooth brick, rising 6 stories, its dormer windows staring down at them like watchful eyes. McPherson explained it had been built as a battalion headquarters before the Civil War, later converted into a POW camp. Teddy spotted the tower he'd seen from the ferry. McPherson identified it as an old lighthouse, no longer used for navigation but now serving as a sewage treatment facility. Chuck lit a cigarette, stifling a yawn as McPherson pointed out the original commander's quarters beyond the wall, now occupied by Dr. Cawley. As they looped around the back, Teddy noticed a middle-aged woman gardener with a scar across her throat. She stared at him, raised a finger to her lips, smiled, and shook her head slowly, a gesture that felt like a warning. McPherson continued his praise of Cawley, a legend in his field who'd published his first paper at 20 and consulted for Scotland Yard, ME5, and the OSS. Teddy pressed for details about the OSS connection, but McPherson could only offer that it was classified war work. Chuck noted dryly that it couldn't be that classified if they were discussing it. Inside the hospital, they navigated a marble foyer and a series of security checkpoints, producing their badges multiple times. The security was heavy, with a cage housing a guard surrounded by keys. McPherson explained that they took every precaution because this facility handled only the most damaged patients, the ones no one else could manage. Teddy mentioned Vincent Grice, the patient who'd scalped his relatives and made hats from their skin, a case that had made the papers. At Dr. Cawley's office, McPherson paused at the door, reflecting that in a less enlightened age, a patient like Grice would have been executed. But here, they could study him, maybe isolate the abnormality in his brain, and eventually root that kind of disengagement out of society. Chuck offered a dry comment about the value of dreams. Inside, Dr. Cawley was thin to the point of emaciation, with sunken cheeks and pitted skin, but he had an explosive smile and a grip that surprised Teddy with its strength. He greeted them warmly, dismissed McPherson, and settled behind his desk. When Teddy asked what McPherson was eager for, Cawley spoke of the moral fusion between law and clinical care, contrasting past brutality, shackles, beatings, drownings with their current approach of moral treatment. Teddy pressed the point about victims, noting that these were violent offenders who had hurt and murdered people. Cawley acknowledged the violence, but argued that his job was to treat the patients, not their victims. He could only concern himself with the limits of his own work. Teddy pressed the point again, demanding to know why a patient's sense of calm should matter more than the suffering of their victims. Cawley reiterated his professional limits. His job was to treat the patients, not to help their victims. Then he asked if a senator had explained the situation, which caught both marshals off guard. Teddy clarified they'd been assigned by the state field office and knew nothing about a senator. Cawley adjusted his position, folding his hands under his chin, and asked what they'd been told. Teddy explained they were investigating a missing female prisoner. Cawley corrected him with a flat smile. Patient and confirmed she'd escaped the previous night between 10 and midnight, and still hadn't been found. The conversation drifted into an odd detour about names. Cawley probed Chuck's Armenian heritage and Teddy's Irish lineage, musing about how Margaret became Peggy and Edward became Teddy. Chuck turned the question back on Cawley, asking if anyone called him Jack, but he deflected, saying most people just called him Doctor. Chuck asked if the patient was dangerous. Cawley explained that all their patients had a proclivity for violence, and then he recounted Rachel Solando's story, a war widow who had drowned her 3 children in a lake, arranged them around the kitchen table, and ate a meal before inviting a neighbor to join her. She still believed her children were alive and waiting for her, which explained her attempts to escape. She came from a small town in the Berkshires, 150 miles away, and the only way off the island was to swim 11 miles or head north to Newfoundland, both impossible. Teddy asked if the grounds had been searched thoroughly. Cawley confirmed they had, but there was no trace of her. What made it more disturbing was that her room had been locked from the outside, the window barred, and there was no sign of tampering. She'd simply vanished, as if she'd evaporated through the walls. Teddy jotted down the word evaporated and pressed for confirmation that she'd been in her room at lights out. Cawley was positive. He called for an orderly named Ganton, who arrived shortly. Teddy asked for aspirin, citing seasickness, and Cawley provided some along with water and cigarettes. Cawley then showed them a photograph of Rachel Solando, a beautiful young woman with dark rings under her eyes and a gaze that seemed to howl with madness. Teddy felt an uncomfortable familiarity, reminded of a boy he'd seen in the camps who'd starved himself to death. Chuck let out a low whistle, and Collie asked if they were reacting to her beauty or her madness. They said both. Ganton entered, a tall Negro with gray flecks in his hair, and Teddy sensed fear emanating from him, a wariness of the law. Collie introduced him as the head orderly who had escorted Rachel to her room the previous night. Ganton explained that she'd attended a group therapy session at 9, then he'd escorted her to her room. Collie clarified that the group session had been led by Dr. Sheehan and Nurse Marino. Ganton continued his account. The group ended around 10. He escorted Rachel to her room, locked the door, and then conducted the routine checks every 2 hours. At midnight, he looked through the window and saw her bed empty. Assuming she might be sleeping on the floor, something patients often did, he unlocked the door and entered. He checked the closet and under the bed, but she was nowhere to be found. He then checked the window and bars, which were still locked tight, and called the warden. Teddy pressed for details on the search. Had Ganton checked the closet and under the bed? Yes. Had he done so with the door still open? Ganton hesitated, then confirmed he'd looked quickly and shut the door behind him. Teddy noted that a 5-second search might have missed her if she'd been pressed against the wall, but Collie interjected that the room was so small it would have been impossible to miss her standing anywhere inside. Ganton left, clearly resentful of the questioning, and the marshals decided to see the room for themselves. The room was tiny, a cell in all but name. The steel door swung inward. There was a small closet, a barred window, and a narrow bed. With 3 of them inside, there was barely room to move. Teddy asked who else had access to the room at night. Collie mentioned orderlies and nurses, but doctors had to sign out their keys by 10. Teddy and Chuck pressed for access to the sign-in logs and personnel files to rule out the possibility of help from the inside. Collie was reluctant, but Teddy warned that obstructing a federal investigation was a serious matter. Collie reluctantly agreed to accommodate their request. Collie then showed them a large sheet of paper found behind the dresser, a cryptic message titled, "The Law of 4, with a series of numbers and a question, "Who is 67? Teddy suggested. They might be the 3 in the riddle, but Chuck dismissed it as a reach. Collie explained that Rachel's delusions were built on a complex narrative structure, and the code was likely part of that framework. Chuck dryly noted he'd need a degree to understand it. Collie made a comparison between childhood lies told to parents and the elaborate fictions Rachel Solando had constructed for herself. He pointed out that a child facing a simple question would often embellish and twist the truth into something fantastical, not to be believed, but to confuse and exhaust the listener until they gave up. That same principle, he explained, was what Rachel did to herself. For 4 years, she'd refused to acknowledge she was in an institution at all. In her mind, she was still home in the Berkshires, and the staff doctors, orderlies, anyone who crossed her path were just delivery men or milkmen passing through. She'd willed her illusions into solidity, pushing reality aside through sheer force. Teddy pressed him on that, wondering how the truth could fail to break through when she was surrounded by the obvious signs of a hospital. Collie answered with a chilling observation. If a paranoid schizophrenic believes she alone possesses the truth, then everyone else must be lying. And if everyone else is lying, anything they say is automatically a lie. Chuck saw the logic immediately and summarized it, and Collie confirmed he was following. Teddy asked if that logic could be applied to the numbers on the page. Collie believed it had to be, because nothing Rachel did was random. She had to think constantly to keep her mental architecture intact, and that eye chart was the architecture written down the key, he suspected, to where she had gone. For a fleeting moment, Teddy felt the code begin to open for him. The 47 and 80 triggered something, a half-formed recognition scratching at his mind like a song he couldn't quite place. The 47 seemed obvious, almost within reach, right in front of him, impossibly simple. But before he could grasp it, the connection dissolved and his mind went blank, the bridge collapsing. He set the page down. Chuck observed, dryly, that where she'd gone was insane. Collie agreed without hesitation. They stepped out of the room and into the corridor. Teddy confirmed with Collie that the staircase was the only way off the floor, that there was no roof access except via a locked fire escape gate that would have required keys. The roof had been checked, along with every room in the ward. An orderly sat at the top of the stairs around the clock. Ganton, actually, who had been on duty that night. They walked down, Chuck noting the impossibility of it. She got out of a locked room, past an orderly at the top of the stairs, somehow made herself invisible, descended to the main living area. That space opened before them at the bottom of the last flight, couches against the walls, a large folding table, bay windows flooding the room with light. Cawley explained it was where patients gathered in the evenings, where group therapy had been held. After lights out, the orderlies were supposed to be cleaning but often ended up playing cards at the base of the stairs. The night before, 7 men had been at it, full tilt. Chuck exhaled slowly, shaking his head. She'd done her invisible trick again, moving either right or left. To the right lay the dining area and kitchen. Beyond that, a cage door with an alarm set after 9. To the left, the nurse's station and staff lounge, no exit to the outside. The only ways out were the door across the living area or the corridor behind the stairs, both manned. Cawley glanced at his watch and excused himself, directing them to McPherson for any further questions and to the mess hall for dinner, after which the staff would assemble for questioning. He hurried out, disappearing left around the corner. Teddy voiced what was becoming unmistakable. This felt like an inside job. Chuck countered with a joking suggestion that she had a formula for invisibility. Maybe watching him right now something to consider. That afternoon they joined the search party, heading inland as the breeze grew heavier and warmer. The island was a tangle of overgrowth, weeds and tall grass threaded with ancient oak and thorn-covered vines, impassable even with machetes. Rachel Solando could never have crossed it, and Teddy noticed a listlessness in the search, as if only he and Chuck truly cared. The men moved along the inner ring above the shoreline with sullen steps, and eventually they rounded a bend on a shelf of black rock to face a cliff towering out into the sea. Beyond some moss and thorns lay a glade dropping away at the base of low hills, the hills rising in a chain toward the jagged cliff. Teddy spotted cuts in the hills, oblong holes in the cliffside, and asked if they were caves. McPherson confirmed a few existed. Teddy asked if they'd been checked. McPherson sighed, lighting a thin cigar with a cupped match, and pointed out that Rachel had left both pairs of shoes in her room. How could she traverse that terrain barefoot? Teddy suggested she might have taken the long way, working up from the west. McPherson countered, gesturing to the marshland and the thick vegetation covering the base of the hills, poison ivy, live oak, sumac, all thorny and punishing. Chuck asked whether that meant the thorns were large or small, and McPherson smiled, suggesting somewhere in between. Chuck nodded, accepting the assessment. McPherson drove his point home. She'd have had no choice but to stay glued to the shoreline, and in either direction she'd run out of beach before long, meeting one of those cliffs. An hour later, they reached the other side of the island, where the fence line cut across the landscape. Beyond it, the old fort and the lighthouse came into view, the lighthouse ringed by its own fence with 2 guards at the gate, rifles held against their chests. Teddy asked if that was the septic processing facility. McPherson confirmed it. Teddy exchanged a glance with Chuck, who raised his eyebrows, and Teddy repeated the words with disbelief. At dinner, no one joined them. They sat alone, damp from the intermittent rain, the warm breeze now carrying the ocean's weight. Outside, the island began to rattle as the breeze tightened into wind. Chuck ticked off the impossibility of it on his fingers, a locked room, barefoot, past 3 interior checkpoints, past a room full of orderlies. Teddy added to the list over an electrified wall or through a manned gate, out into the elements, barefoot, unseen. Chuck wondered aloud where the dead went on this island. There had to be deaths after all, and suggested a cemetery. Teddy hadn't seen one, probably fenced in somewhere like the septic plant. Chuck pushed his tray aside and asked who they'd be speaking to next. The staff, Teddy said. Chuck asked if he thought they'd be helpful. Teddy turned the question back on him, and Chuck answered with a soft laugh, smoke puffing from his grin. Teddy took the center of the room later that night. The staff circled around him. He laid out the basic facts: an escape, a vanished patient, no evidence that she could have managed it without assistance from inside. McPherson agreed that was a reasonable assessment. Colley interrupted to request introductions, and Teddy and Chuck gave their names. Teddy ran through the search results with McPherson. No evidence of flight, no torn clothing, no footprints, no bent vegetation. The tide had been too strong for swimming. Nurse Marino suggested she might have tried anyway and drowned, but Colley dismissed that quickly, saying the tide would have brought her ashore. She held up her hands in mock surrender, and Colley pressed Teddy to continue, the staff clearly fatigued. Teddy questioned Ganton next, confirming that he'd checked on Solando at midnight and found her gone, the locks untampered with. Ganton insisted. His eyes had never left the third-floor corridor except for those 15 seconds when he entered her room and discovered she was missing. He hadn't left his post, hadn't even gotten coffee. Chuck stepped in, proposing a hypothetical that she somehow crawled across the ceiling and asked who she'd have had to pass on the way down to the second floor. An orderly named Glenn Miga raised his hand, and Teddy pressed him. Under questioning, Glenn admitted he'd left his post to use the bathroom just a minute or so, around 11:30. Colley was displeased, but the damage was done. Chuck turned the focus to the poker game, asking if it had still been going on at that hour. Several orderlies confirmed it, and Chuck identified the ringleader, a round, fleshy man with a shaved head, Trey Washington. Trey explained they'd been sitting in the center of the room with clear views of the staircase, the front door, and the back door. Chuck acknowledged the strategic positioning. Trey Washington lowered his voice, explaining that the vigilance wasn't just about the patients, it was about certain doctors and nurses who didn't approve of the card games. They had to be able to spot approaching trouble quickly enough to grab a mop and look busy. Chuck grinned, noting how fast they must move, and Trey shot back that lightning in August was sluggish compared to him. The remark broke the tension, drawing a smile from Nurse Marino and a quiet shift among the orderlies, and Teddy recognized immediately that Chuck was cast as the good cop for the duration of their stay. He had a rare ease with people, able to bridge any gap of color or background. Teddy wondered how Seattle had let him go, girlfriend and all. Teddy knew his own role was different. Alpha male, the kind who generated tension until men accepted him, the way they'd had to in the war. Chuck quieted the laughter and circled back to Trey, asking when they'd known something was wrong. Trey explained that when Ganton started shouting to call the warden, he checked the clock instinctively, a habit forged from filling out incident reports, where the first question was always the time. Several orderlies nodded in agreement, and Chuck caught Teddy's eye. So 12:02 and change, Teddy asked Ganton about the extra 2 minutes, and Ganton confirmed he'd checked several rooms before reaching Solando's, hers being the 5th down the hallway. Trey supplied the rest. A guard named Hicksville came through first at 12:06, and the warden followed 4 minutes later with 6 men. Nurse Marino said she'd locked the nurses' station and emerged around the same time Hicksville arrived. Teddy pressed her about whether anyone could have slipped past her, and she pointed out that the only place beyond her station was hydrotherapy, a sealed cement room with tubs and small pools, and it had been checked. McPherson confirmed. Teddy shifted to the group therapy session, asking if anything out of the ordinary had occurred. Marino parried with a dry comment about what counted as unusual in a place like this, and when he rephrased the question, she said nothing remarkable had happened. Rachel had spoken a couple of times, mostly about the rain and complaining about the food. Colley stepped in to say they were waiving confidentiality, and Teddy learned the session had focused on anger management prompted by a recent uptick in volatility among patients, likely from the heat. Rachel hadn't shown any anger issues of late. Teddy asked about Dr. Sheehan, who had run the group. A silence fell over the room. Colley eventually said Sheehan had left on the morning ferry, the same one Teddy and Chuck had taken. Teddy demanded to know why, and Colley explained it was a long-planned vacation. He'd departed the facility at 10 the previous night, retired to his quarters, and left in the morning. Teddy turned to McPherson, who confirmed he'd approved the departure despite the lockdown, having ascertained Sheehan's whereabouts during the night and seen no reason to detain him. Teddy was incredulous, Allowing a doctor to leave during a lockdown was a breach he'd never encountered. He demanded to know where Sheehan had gone. New York, Colley said. Park Avenue, his family's home. Teddy insisted on a phone number, and Colley, after a hesitation, agreed to provide it. Teddy said there was something else he needed a phone. But the nurse's station phone was dead, and 4 others in the ward gave only white hiss. Teddy and Colley walked to the central switchboard, where the operator reported that even radio was down. The weather on the other side was the problem, he said, not so much conditions here. Colley told him to keep trying and to get word to him. When it was up, the marshal needed to make a call. The operator nodded and turned back to his work. Outside, the air pressed in like trapped breath. Colley asked what happened if a marshal failed to check in, and Teddy explained that the field office would mark it in their nightly reports, usually waiting 24 hours before growing concerned. Colley suggested it might blow over by then. Teddy shot back that the storm hadn't even started yet, and Colley shrugged it off, heading toward the gate with an invitation for drinks and cigars at his house that night. Teddy asked if they could talk then, but Colley paused, the dark trees swaying and whispering beyond the wall, and said they'd already been talking. Later, Teddy and Chuck walked the dark grounds, the storm swelling hot around them, the air distended and oppressive. Teddy voiced his frustration. The whole situation was rotten, and Chuck agreed with a dry Baptist-flavored amen, explaining that he'd picked up the expression during a year in Mississippi. Teddy bummed another cigarette and asked if Chuck had called the field office. He hadn't. The switchboard was down, supposedly because of the storm. Chuck spit tobacco and scoffed, pointing out that the storm hadn't even arrived yet. Teddy conceded the point but said you could feel it coming, though not enough to knock out central communications. He rattled off the impossibility of it all, a woman escaping a locked room past 4-man checkpoints, and a room full of poker-playing orderlies, scaling a wall with electric wire, swimming 11 miles in cold water against an irate current. Chuck latched onto the word, playing with it, and then grew serious, admitting the whole thing felt off. Teddy brought up the missing Dr. Sheehan, and Chuck noted that Teddy hadn't pressed Colley hard enough. They considered the possibility that they themselves were the cover story brought in to authenticate whatever story the institution wanted to tell. Chuck floated the theory that Sheehan had fallen for the attractive patient and helped her escape, possibly with paid-off accomplices or his own boat. Park Avenue money could buy a lot. Teddy wondered why they'd show them the codes in Rachel's room, though. If this was a cover-up, why not make it easier to sign off? Chuck suggested. They might have been lonely, made up a story just to bring in fresh company. But then he turned serious, his voice tightening as he admitted he was starting to get nervous. Colley led them into his mansion, through a parquet foyer to 2 oak doors with brass knobs the size of pineapples. He pulled one open, and the room beyond was vast, a marble floor with dark oriental rugs, a fireplace taller than any man, curtains of purple velvet at 9 windows, a billiards table under oil paintings of a Union colonel and his family. Teddy noted the resemblance to his own apartment on Buttonwood, which could have folded into this room twice over. Colley explained that the colonel had been relieved of command shortly after the paintings were finished. The furniture had been found in the basement, along with enough room to fit the polo grounds. Teddy caught the smell of pipe tobacco and noticed a man in a high-back wing chair, feet crossed, a book propped open. Colley led them toward the fireplace and offered drinks. Chuck requested rye. Teddy asked for soda water and ice. The stranger looked up, a small red head perched on a chunky body with a delicate, pampered air. Colley introduced him as Dr. Jeremiah Mehring, his colleague. The man blinked in acknowledgement, offered no hand, and Teddy and Chuck sat in the chairs curving away from him. Mehring said he was curious, and Teddy replied with flat sarcasm. Mehring pressed Teddy on why he didn't drink, suggesting it was unusual for someone in his line of work. Teddy countered, pointing out that psychiatrists were supposedly overrun with boozers, and Mehring gave a non-committal response. Teddy walked to the bookshelves, noting that Colley kept mostly novels and histories, few medical texts, and turned back to watch Mehring glance at his own glass with a silkworm smile. Mehring complimented Teddy's defense mechanisms and assumed he was adept at interrogation. Teddy corrected him. Marshals brought people in, others handled the questioning. Lehane observed that men of violence fascinated him, which drew a sharp response from Chuck. Lehane clarified that he hadn't called them violent men, only men of violence, and Teddy, with a big smile, invited him to elaborate, as Colley put on a record mauler, which reminded Teddy of a Dachau sub-commandant he'd watched die to similar music. Lehane made a series of observations. Neither man had ever walked away from physical conflict. Both had lost their fathers before age 15. Teddy deflected with sarcasm, calling it a parlor trick, and dismissed the whole line of questioning. When Lehane brought up God, Teddy brought up death camps. When Lehane pressed Chuck, Chuck shrugged off any belief in God, and Lehane noted his father's death. Teddy grew tired of the game, accusing Lehane of trying to teach a woman to walk through walls. Lehane returned to Teddy's defense mechanisms, but Teddy cut him off, pointing out the facility's flagrant security breaches and the missing woman. Lehane claimed they were looking, but Teddy demanded to know if they were looking hard. A glance passed between Lehane and Colley explained that Lehane was chief liaison to the Board of Overseers and had been asked to address Teddy's earlier requests. When Teddy specified those requests' personnel files, specifically Sheehan's, Lehane refused. Teddy accused him of obstruction. Lehane told him to continue his investigation within limits, but Teddy announced the investigation was over. They'd take the first ferry back and file their reports, turning the matter over to Hoover's people. Colley, after a long silence, acquiesced. They left into a downpour, drenched in the few steps from porch to car. McPherson drove, and Teddy watched the blurry forms of Colley and Lehane on the porch receding behind them. McPherson remarked on the night, and Chuck asked how long he'd worked there. McPherson said he'd been there 4 years. No breaks ever, not even a breach, someone missing for an hour or two. Teddy asked about Dr. Sheehan. McPherson knew him, said he'd been there a year before McPherson, so about 5 years total. He didn't think Sheehan worked much with Solando. Colley was her primary therapist. Teddy wondered if that was common, the chief of staff taking primary cases. McPherson hedged, said it depended, that Colley did a lot of primary work with Ward C patients and a few others. Teddy pressed for names besides Solando, but McPherson pulled up outside the dormitory and deflected, suggesting they get some sleep and that Colley would answer questions in the morning. Teddy told him he wasn't very good at this, whatever this was, and stepped out into the rain. They shared a room with Trey Washington and Bibby Luce. Teddy and Chuck dried off and joined the card game, penny ante with cigarettes as currency. Teddy won a few bucks and some smokes on a club flush, then played conservative. Chuck, however, turned out to be the real player, jovial, unreadable, piling up coins and bills. When Trey accused him of voodoo, Chuck pointed out Trey's tell tugging his earlobe when he had less than a full house. He also noted Bibby's squirrely-eyed bluffing versus serene inwardness when he had a hot hand. Trey asked about Teddy's tell, but Chuck refused to rat out his partner. Trey joked it was a white man thing, and Chuck played along with a dark look that broke into a grin, and they all laughed. Later in the dark, Teddy asked Chuck what his tell was. Chuck deflected, then admitted Teddy pursed his lips when holding a good hand. They talked about their fathers. Chuck's was a prick, Teddy's was a stranger who'd lost his boat and drifted away. Chuck asked if they were really going to quit. Teddy said yeah. They had no way through to the truth, couldn't break a whole society that didn't want to talk. But Chuck had never quit anything before. Teddy conceded the threat might have made Colley rethink things, but Chuck saw through it. He just played cards with Teddy and knew a bluff when he saw one. They fell silent, Teddy listening to the ocean. He dreamed of Dolores, angry, holding an empty bottle of his whiskey, demanding to know if he was ever sober. He couldn't speak, couldn't see his own body. She walked down the hallway, her back charred and smoking, then turned to a window and said something about things floating. Teddy was beside her, his hand on her shoulder, her skin wet. The view outside wasn't Buttonwood but a cabin by a pond with smooth logs turning in the moonlight. She talked about the gazebo, about Rachel being here, about the law of 4 being code. She said he couldn't leave. Teddy wrapped his arms around her from behind, burying his face in her neck, telling her he loved her and wouldn't leave. But her belly sprang a leak, liquid flowing through his fingers. She told him she was bones in a box, that he needed to wake up, that he had to face it. She wasn't there. She was here. He was here. And he was there too. Count the beds, she said. Lettuce. The name crawled through Teddy's flesh, over his bones, and he denied it. But she insisted he'd known all along. He couldn't leave. He needed her shoulders, trying to soothe her, and she said she wasn't tense anymore. She was home. But this wasn't home, he said. She said it was her home, that she and Lettuce were there. She needed to go. He begged her to stay, tears spilling down her body, mixing with her leaking belly, and she kissed his knuckles, told him to hold tight, and he held her, and held her. At 5 a.m, Teddy climbed down from the bunk, took his notebook and sat at the poker table. The rain was still falling, Trey and Bibby snoring, Chuck sleeping quietly with a fist near his ear. Teddy looked at the Law of 4. It was simple once you knew how to read it, a child's code, and it took him until 6 to break it. He looked up to find Chuck watching him, chin on his fist. Chuck asked if they were leaving. Teddy shook his head. Trey, climbing out of his bunk and pulling up the shade on a drowning landscape, said nobody was leaving in that weather. The dream's hold loosened, the smell of her evaporating, and Teddy felt the familiar weight of missing her. He wondered if this would be the day it finally broke him. If he could trade places with her, he would have given, always had been. But the years passed, and the loss only grew, a wound that wouldn't scar. He wanted to tell them all that he'd held her, that this world couldn't give him that, only reminders of what he'd never have long enough. They were supposed to grow old together, have kids, die together. Not this. If dying meant holding her again, he'd do it without hesitation. Chuck was still waiting, and Teddy told him he'd broken Rachel's code. Chuck asked if that was all, with mock surprise. Collie met them in the foyer of Ward B, soaked and exhausted. Chuck joked that the trick was to sleep when you lie down, and Collie played along wearily. They climbed the stairs, passing an orderly, and Teddy asked about Naring. Collie apologized, explaining Naring was a genius but lacked social polish, obsessed with a book about male warrior culture. Teddy asked if they often sat around probing people over drinks, and Collie responded with a psychiatrist joke, how many shrinks to screw in a light bulb? 8, because you'd have to stop overanalyzing it. They all laughed. Collie said, the mental health field was in a state of warfare, ideological, philosophical, psychological. They passed the second-floor landing as a patient screamed from below, a hopeless, plaintive howl. Collie explained the old school believed in shock therapy and psychosurgery, the new school in psychopharmacology. He paused midway up the stairs, exhaustion hanging off him, and Chuck asked how psychopharmacology applied. Collie explained that a new drug called lithium had been approved, one that relaxed psychotic patients and might eventually make manacles obsolete. The old school argued psychosurgery was irreplaceable, but the new school had money behind it, pharmaceutical companies. Teddy asked which school Collie belonged to, and he said he believed in talk therapy, basic interpersonal skills, the radical idea that treating patients with respect and listening might actually reach them. Another howl cut through the air, sharpening his attention. He conceded. Many patients needed medication and restraints, but warned it was a slippery slope. Once you poisoned the well, you couldn't get it out. Teddy agreed. Collie acknowledged he was mixing metaphors and, with a nod to Chuck's earlier advice, led them up the final flight. In Rachel's room, Collie sat heavily on the bed, and Chuck leaned against the door. Chuck cracked a joke about surrealists and light bulbs, fish, he said, and Collie responded dryly. Teddy held up the sheet of paper and asked them to look again. Collie, exhausted, saw only gibberish. Teddy walked them through the code, the plus sign, the numbers, the way they added up to 13. He explained the number to letter assignation, Rachel's name adding to 47, her last name to 80. Chuck was stunned, calling him Einstein. Collie asked if Teddy had broken code before, and Teddy said no, he just liked puzzles and crosswords. Collie pressed about Army intelligence, but Teddy said regular Army. Collie, however, had been awesome consulting, he said, the never talk about it kind. They worked through the rest. The three either referred to them or Rachel's children. the 4 being Rachel plus the children. But 67 was the one Teddy couldn't crack nothing he was familiar with, so it had to be something on the island. Collie had no theories. Teddy said he was leaving on the first ferry. Collie said there wouldn't be one today, maybe not tomorrow either. He didn't think Rachel was still out there in the storm. Teddy asked where she was, but Collie said it wasn't his specialty. Teddy said the code was a template for deciphering future messages, a guide, and he bet on it. Teddy concluded that Rachel wasn't trying to escape at all. She'd brought them there, and there were probably more codes in this building or out on the island. Collie, exhausted and steadying himself against the windowsill, asked to what end. Teddy turned the question back on him. Collie closed his eyes for a long moment, then opened them and said he had a full day ahead: meetings, budget, storm preparations, but he'd arranged for them to interview all the patients from Rachel's group therapy session, starting in 15 minutes. Teddy pressed for Sheehan's personnel file, but Collie refused, saying the switchboard was trying his number but couldn't reach anyone. He asked for patience, said they'd find Rachel, or find out what happened. Then he left. Under an awning outside, Chuck asked if Collie knew what 67 meant. Teddy said yes. Chuck asked if he'd broken the code before Teddy had. Teddy said Collie had been OS and had gifts. They considered the patient count maybe 50 total, not quite 67. Teddy remembered Dolores's dream: count the beds. They wondered how many were in the fort. Chuck noted the wasted federal space, the buildings that could hold hundreds, the staff-to-patient ratio favoring staff 2 to 1. He asked what the place really was. In the cafeteria, they interviewed the patients. The first, Ken Gage, was a stubbled wreck of ticks and blinks, hunched and scratching his arms, refusing to meet their eyes. He'd attacked a stranger in a grocery store with a can of peas, muttering about mail. When they asked about group therapy, he only talked about the cold in his feet, hurting to walk. The orderlies, snickering, eventually took him away. The next, Peter Breen, was a 26-year-old knucklecracker with damp eyes. He was afraid of everything: watches, rats, pencils, but mostly of Teddy, who reminded him of his mean-looking father and brothers who'd beaten him. When scared, he said, he lost control. He described his father's nurse, the way she'd looked at him, the fear that had risen in him when she was alone in the kitchen with him. Teddy glanced at Collie's notes. Peter had assaulted her with a broken glass, critically injuring her, but remained in denial about his responsibility. The young man Peter unspooled his fear for them in a trembling rush. He insisted he was harmless by nature, that his violence only emerged when terror seized him, and he painted the nurse, who had been his victim, as a predator, a woman whose very existence had been a taunt designed to humiliate and unman him. His voice was a thin, frantic thread, and even as Chuck tried to steer him with a soothing question, Peter veered into a rambling obsession with the mind itself, describing it as a delicate, unknowable engine where a single minor slip of a gear could send the whole system into chaos. He leaned in close, tendons straining in his neck, to drive home the horror of that internal randomness, that utter lack of control. Teddy listened, a dull, familiar ache beginning to throb behind his own eyes. He understood the man's point, had intimate, painful experience with the mind's capacity to betray itself, but understanding did nothing to soften the contempt rising in his throat. All he could see was the nurse, the woman Peter had carved up with broken glass. He imagined her, just trying to do her job, to earn a living, maybe for a family she had to support. It had been a small, ordinary dream, and this pathetic, sniveling creature had shattered it forever. The urge to act was visceral, a hot pulse in his fists. He wanted to grab Peter, to slam him against the hard metal of the cafeteria ovens, to feel the bones in that pale, smug face give way, to leave a mark so permanent it would never heal. He pictured it, the crack and shatter of cartilage and teeth, the silence that would follow. But he forced the impulse down, his muscles rigid with restraint. Instead, he closed the file in front of him, his voice flat and deliberate, as he steered the conversation back to the matter at hand. He asked about Rachel Solando's group session, and Peter confirmed he'd been there, though he claimed not to have seen her go up to her room. The names of the other patients flowed from him, and then, with a leering knowledge, He mentioned the red-haired nurse, calling her a dirty girl and refusing to offer a real name. When Chuck gently corrected him, pointing out he'd just praised her, Peter backtracked quickly, his mood shifting to a vehement disgust. Teddy could feel the conversation spiraling into the man's personal pathology again, so he cut through, asking if anything unusual had happened in the group. Peter dismissed Rachel as a silent mouse, and then, his eyes bright with a self-righteous, chilling certainty, declared that people like her, who killed their own children, deserve the gas chamber. The table fell quiet. The man's conviction hung in the air like a bad smell, and for a moment, the only sound was the scrape of his chair as he stood to leave. Teddy let him start to go, then casually picked up his pencil, dragging it in a slow, deliberate scratch across the file cover. Peter stopped, the sound catching his attention. He turned back, and Teddy could see the annoyance flicker across his face. He asked a final, almost incidental question, wondering if Peter knew a patient named Andrew Lettuce. Peter shook his head, dismissing the name, then, growing flustered by Teddy's persistent doodling, pleaded with him to stop. Teddy paused, lifting the pencil with mock innocence, and the man thanked him before patting the table and making his exit. Teddy watched him go, his knuckles white where he gripped the pencil, and then he returned to making those idle, irritating scratches on the page. After that, a middle-aged woman named Leonora Grant was brought in. She was utterly lost in a fantasy, convinced she was a silent film star, with Chuck and Teddy cast as famous actors, her rambling monologue drifting between talk of Hollywood and a fictional business meeting. She was affectionate, confusing, and utterly disengaged from their questions, eventually clinging to Chuck's hand so warmly that 2 orderlies had to gently peel her away. She broke free once more to run back and give him a strange final instruction to feed the cat. Chuck, looking into her eyes, simply acknowledged the command. Arthur Tooby was next, a man who insisted on being called Joe. His contribution to the interview was non-existent. He fell asleep twice, the second time for the entire day, his narcolepsy rendering him useless. By then, the throb in Teddy's skull had deepened, a building pressure that made his hair feel like it was standing on end. He was beginning to chafe against the entire enterprise, the sheer grinding weight of the institution's maddening logic. Trey led a small blonde woman to their table. Her name, according to the file, was Bridget Kearns. She looked genuinely lucid, her eyes bright and intelligent, and she smiled at them with a shy, disarming warmth. She spoke with a clear, soft voice about the years she'd been incarcerated, the crime that had put her here, killing her husband with an axe. She admitted to her own dark days and her diagnosis, but she argued, with a chilling pragmatism, that for a woman who was beaten and betrayed, the violence didn't seem so far-fetched. She held Teddy's gaze, and there was something in her expression that caught him off guard, a spark of giddy mischief. He felt a laugh escape him, a genuine surprised sound. She asked him why, and he answered with a blunt, masculine honesty, suggesting that perhaps she shouldn't get out. The truth of it seemed to amuse her, and they shared a strange, disarming moment of laughter. It was a relief, a brief, human connection after the preceding ugliness, and Teddy let himself feel a flicker of something like normalcy. He wondered, for a fleeting moment, if his own sense of what was proper was starting to bend. The moment caught Teddy off guard. When he told her he thought she shouldn't get out, and she immediately pinned his reasoning on his being a man, he didn't bother to deny it. He simply agreed, blunt and unapologetic, and she accepted his answer with an easy, forgiving smile. The exchange felt light, almost flirtatious, and Teddy found himself marveling at the absurdity of it. Here he was, trading pleasantries with a woman who had killed her husband with an axe, a patient in a hospital for the criminally insane. He let himself wonder, with a small, rueful pang, if this was the current state of his life. But the worry didn't stick. It felt, perversely, like a small, harmless indulgence after 2 years of unrelenting grief. Bridget then began to muse aloud about the world she might return to, a world she had heard was filled with bombs that could level cities and strange new boxes that showed plays and pictures. She spoke of it with a kind of fearful wonder, concluding that she wasn't sure she wanted to be part of it, preferring the familiar noise inside her own head to the new clamor of the modern age. It was a moment of clarity, a glimpse of a rational, frightened person. Then Chuck, with a practiced lightness, asked about Rachel Solando. The shift in Bridget was almost immediate. Teddy caught a tiny telltale hitch in her voice. She seemed to reach for an answer, as if selecting a pre-prepared response from a mental file. Teddy noticed it, and scrawled a single damning word in his notebook, shielding it with his hand. Her words that followed were careful, rehearsed, the description of Rachel's delusion sounding so close to Collie's own words from the day before that it was almost a verbatim echo. She described her as a quiet, unobtrusive presence who maintained a fantasy world where she was at home in the Berkshires. Teddy pressed her for more details, noting the holes in her narrative, but she insisted nothing unusual had happened the night of the escape. When he asked specifically about Dr. Sheehan, she became flustered, a flicker of confusion and fear crossing her face before she described him in bland, reassuring terms. Just then, a clever, quiet movement caught Teddy's attention. As Chuck left the table to get a glass of water, Bridget leaned in, her eyes locking onto his. In a swift, furtive motion, she grabbed his notebook and pen, scribbled something on a clean page, and slid the notebook back to him before Chuck could return. She dropped her gaze, feigning indifference. Teddy felt a jolt of static electricity run through him, but he gave nothing away. When Chuck came back, they watched her drink, and she stated, tired and flat, that she had no further information. The session was over. Before she could rise, Teddy asked a final question about Andrew Lettuce. The effect on her was total and chilling. Her face went blank, a smooth, featureless mask. Her hands flattened on the tabletop, as if she were trying to hold it to the ground, and in that strange, stony silence, Teddy saw something else in her eyes, a profound, wrenching sorrow, as if she were on the verge of breaking down. She denied ever hearing the name, her voice empty, and Teddy knew she was lying. Outside, in the shelter of the breezeway, he and Chuck stepped into the spitting rain. Their conversation turned to Bridget's performance. Chuck conceded. She sounded coached, and Teddy pressed on it, pointing out how she had parroted Collie's phrasing, how her description of the group's topic, anger management, had felt like she was studying for a quiz. He was left with a boiling knot of questions and no answers. Chuck, watching the man, asked a pointed question: who was Andrew Lettuce? It was a soft question, but it cut to the heart of the matter. Teddy lit a cigarette, buying time. He admitted he'd asked every patient they'd interviewed, and Chuck noted the obsessive pattern. The admission hung between them. Teddy leaned back against the stone, feeling the weight of his own subterfuge. He had to trust Chuck, he told him, but his motives were complicated. He'd claimed the case from his office the moment it came in. It was a confession of partiality, an admission that his purpose wasn't just to find a missing patient. Chuck met his eyes, considered him for a long moment. He understood the need for trust. He spoke of his own life, his Japanese-American girlfriend, his scar, a long, vicious mark from a sword, and his loyalty to the country that had failed him. His voice was full of weariness and defiance. He held Teddy's gaze, the rain falling between them, a silent question: would he hold his partner's secrets? Teddy watched him, struck by the raw conviction in the man's voice. He recognized that kind of devotion knew its weight, its absolute clarity. He told Chuck to hold on to it, to never let it go. It was the purest feeling he knew. Chuck's response was a quiet promise, but he steered the conversation back to the question that had been hanging between them. He needed to know who Andrew Lettuce was. Teddy felt the weight of the moment settle on him like a stone. He couldn't carry this alone. He thought of his wife, of his failures, his drinking, the times he'd abandoned her, let her drown in her own darkness. He made a silent vow to her, a plea for atonement. He said the name, and a word lodged in his throat. He forced himself to continue. Lettuce, he explained, had been the maintenance man in their apartment building, and he was an arsonist. He could see the understanding dawning on Chuck's face even before he finished. Lettuce had started the fire that killed her, the fire that had claimed his wife. The confession left him raw. He moved to the edge of the breezeway, letting the rain soak his face and hair, and the memory of her flooded back. The last morning. She had been desperate, clinging to him, begging him to stay. He remembered the weight of her arms around his neck, the frantic edge in her voice. She'd tried to seduce him in the shower, her hands pressing against him, her teeth grazing his chest. But he was late, hungover, and he pushed her away. Gently, but he pushed her away. She'd made a deal with him, just 1 hour, just one. He'd refused, turning his face to the spray, and she'd started talking about the war in Korea, about the communists, about how the world was going to blow up. He'd told her to stop reading the papers, but she couldn't stop. He remembered the panic in her eyes, the fragility that he'd willed himself to ignore. She'd latched onto a memory, their first meeting at the coconut grove, and when he cut her off, rushing to leave, he saw the faint, telltale traces of soap he'd left on her skin. He suggested she dry off, but she only said the moment was already gone. The grove had burned down while he was away at war. She'd found some terrible meaning in that. He remembered the song she used to sing, Buffalo Girls, a ghost of a voice from their honeymoon. But that morning, her talk of the world's terror had only annoyed him. He snapped at her, told her to stop reading the papers, and she asked him, a plaintive, fractured question, if he had someone else. Her voice was small, trembling. He could see her reflection in a mirror, her body marked with streaks of white soap. Something about it unsettled him, made him feel a sense of violation he couldn't name. The accusation hung in the steamy air of the bathroom. She pressed him, her voice raw and desperate, and he snapped back, his own frustration boiling over. He told her he worked, that he was just tired, that her talk of bombs and the end of the world had drained the moment of any passion. She dismissed his excuses with a bitter shrug, her body language a coiled accusation. She said he didn't want her anymore, and the word she used was harsh, a deliberate provocation. He recoiled, telling her she couldn't speak that way in their house. She pushed harder, taunting him, asking what word she was allowed to use for her own body, and he saw a dark, ugly satisfaction in her eyes as she finally threw the word at him like a slap. The shock of it, the raw obscenity, made him flinch. The razor he was holding dug deep into his jaw, a searing, blinding pain that flooded his head with a white-hot fire. The wound welled with blood and shaving cream, a grotesque mess in the sink. She tried to help, offering a towel, but he pushed her away, reeling from the cut and the bitter, unbearable truth of her desperation. He bled into the basin, and the sorrow that welled up in him was for everything, for the girl he'd fallen in love with, for the fractured world, for his own useless drinking, for a war he'd fought with a naive hope that it would end all the violence. She sobbed her apologies, and he finally took the towel from her. But he couldn't look at her, couldn't touch her. He could only hear the tears in her voice and feel the world collapsing around them. He walked out that morning with a lie on his lips to the press. To the world, he'd said his last words to her were of love, but the truth was colder, a bitter final command. He'd told her, with a brutal, desperate finality, to get herself together, to think of her responsibilities, to fix her broken head. Those were the last words she ever heard from him. He reached the door, stepped out into the hall, and paused on the landing. He felt a pull to go back, to make it right, or at least softer, but he didn't. He walked away. Later, in the damp of the breezeway, their conversation was interrupted by a strange, shuffling procession. A patient, a woman named Maggie, was being led to hydrotherapy, her ankles and wrists in chains. She stopped to confront them, her voice a ragged, prophetic shout. She refused to bake pies, she declared, and she told them, with an eerie certainty, that they had been here and would stay here. She sniffed the air around them, finding the scent of secrets that fed the hell of this place. Then, a flicker of sanity passed behind her eyes. She smiled at Chuck, telling him to laugh. It was good for the soul. She touched his nose, a gentle maternal gesture, and said she wanted to remember him laughing. As she shuffled away, Chuck remarked on her strange nature, and Teddy found himself returning to the story of Lettuce. He explained that the man was a firebug, the maintenance man who had started the fire. It had taken a year for the truth to emerge, when Lettuce struck again, torching a schoolhouse with the same signature method. He'd been committed, and eventually transferred to this island. They had seen no trace of him in the other wards. The conversation grew tense as Chuck pressed him, asking what he intended to do if he found Lettuce. Teddy hedged, evading the question. A pair of nurses passed, sharing a laugh with Chuck's easy charm, and Teddy found himself envious of the man's lightness, his ability to believe in the essential rightness of things. He missed that. He remembered the last morning with Dolores, her mention of the Coconut Grove fire, and the weight of his own failures settled back on his shoulders. Teddy found himself reminiscing about the Coconut Grove, the night he'd met his wife. He told Chuck how he'd danced with her all night, even the foxtrot, and Chuck couldn't picture it. Teddy insisted that if Chuck had seen her that night, he'd have danced a jig if she'd asked. The conversation brought back the weight of her tragedy. The club had burned down while he was overseas, and his wife had found a terrible personal meaning in that coincidence. She had been terrified of fire, and yet she had died in one. The irony was a raw, unhealed wound. Chuck, sensing Teddy's turmoil, made a blunt offer. He would back him, no matter what. If Teddy wanted to find Lettuce and kill him, it was all the same to him. Teddy smiled at the old slang, but Chuck pushed him. He needed to know what to expect. He accused Teddy of knowing more about this place than he was letting on, of coming here with a hidden agenda to cause damage. Teddy deflected with a joke, then turned to face the rain, inviting them both to get wetter. They left through the gate and walked the shore, the storm lashing them. Teddy shouted over the roar of the waves that he didn't want to kill Lettuce. He claimed he was tired of killing, a bloodlust from the war that had left him numb to the count. But Chuck was skeptical, saying he'd kill the man twice if it were his wife. They climbed inland, seeking shelter in a circle of high trees. There, Teddy laid out his plan, or at least his public one. He said he was still putting the job first: find Rachel Solando. If he crossed paths with Lettuce, he'd confront him, let him know he was waiting on the mainland, and that as long as he was alive, Lettuce would never breathe free air. He insisted that was all. Chuck didn't believe him, and he pressed further, asking if Collie knew the real reason he was here. Teddy insisted he was here for Rachel Solando, claiming Lettuce had never been convicted of the arson, so there was nothing to tie them together. Chuck changed tack, suggesting they search the graveyard. A headstone with Lettuce's name would settle half the battle. Teddy agreed. But then Chuck circled back to the patient, Bridget. He knew she'd communicated something to Teddy in secret. Teddy admitted she'd written something and pulled out his notebook, flipping through it, as Chuck whistled a jaunty, almost offensive tune to pass the time. When Teddy found the page, he showed it to Chuck, who saw the single scrawled word, already bleeding in the rain run. As the sky darkened and the storm worsened, they came across a field littered with small stones, arranged in what appeared to be deliberate piles. Teddy sensed a pattern and counted them. They seemed to be in separate groups, each about 6 inches apart. He put his hand on Chuck's shoulder, pointing. Chuck didn't see it at first, dismissing them as rocks, but Teddy was insistent. They worked their way down, and Teddy realized they'd miscounted. There was a single stone forming its own pile between the others. 13 piles in total. It was a code. Someone had left this for them. Eddie hunkered down, shielding his notebook from the rain with his coat. Dan moved with a careful, crab-like precision, counting the stones in each of the 13 piles and recording the numbers. Chuck quipped about them being a combination to the world's biggest padlock, and Teddy closed the book, pocketing it with a dry acknowledgement. The storm was gaining force, the wind finding its voice as they pushed north, shoulders pressed together for support, the cliffs on one side and the shrouded asylum on the other. The weather intensified, and Chuck shouted a question about Teddy's Army intelligence background. Teddy admitted he'd been in intel, but had been discharged as regular Army after a catastrophic mistake. He'd misread coordinates, costing half a battalion their lives. The memory was still a raw, vivid scar, the sounds of screams and static over the radio, a boy's voice asking in the chaos if anyone could see where the rest of him went. He'd served them up like meatloaf, he confessed, and the shame of it was a permanent weight. Chuck expressed a quiet, horrified sympathy, and they trudged on, their heads down. They stumbled into a graveyard without realizing it, the headstones materializing out of the driving rain. A tree split and crashed nearby, its pieces whipping past them. They pushed through the chaos, falling nearly blinded, until Teddy spotted the dark hulking shape of a mausoleum. He forced the broken door open against the gale, and they tumbled inside, away from the shrieking wind that was now thick with debris. Inside, the relative stillness was a shock. The center slab was empty of a coffin, and they sat on a stone bench as Chuck fumbled with a pack of matches. He lit 3 at once, their brief flame revealing the austere, abandoned room. The storm raged outside, pounding the walls, the door hammering against its frame. Chuck marveled at the violent beauty of it, the way the world was tearing itself apart. Teddy, remembering a childhood spent on his father's boat, found the chaos almost peaceful compared to the bone-deep cold of the Ardennes. They talked about war, about killing. Chuck shared a memory of North Africa, the heat, and a man he'd shot who was so soft from the heat he'd watched the bullet fly out the other side of his body. Teddy countered with the story of Dachau, the massacre of SS guards, the cheering reporters, the camp prisoners tearing men apart. It was a brutal, necessary act, he said, a murder that was also justice. But it was still a wrong, a thing that could never be explained or washed off. It was a weight they would carry forever. He leaned back, exhausted, the conversation dwindling into the howling silence. Chuck tried to find a moral foothold, insisting that at least their actions in the war had been for the right reasons, that they had stopped Hitler and saved millions. Teddy conceded the point, admitting that sometimes that had to be enough. Chuck pressed, needing to believe it was, and a surreal sight cut through their conversation. An entire tree, upside down, swept past the mausoleum door. They watched it go, sharing a dark, quiet joke about the tree waking up in the middle of the ocean, confused and displaced, before their laughter faded into the howling wind. The conversation turned to the island itself. Chuck asked Teddy how much he really knew, and Teddy admitted he knew enough to be scared. He laid out what he'd uncovered. The facility was a haven for radical experimental therapies, funded by a heat-walk slush fund. He speculated they were experimenting on the mind, possibly sharing their findings with Colley's old OS contacts. He mentioned hallucinogenic drugs that could make a sane person see the world as a schizophrenic does, and he painted a vivid picture of what that could mean: cobras for arms, a tiger charging from a bush. Chuck was skeptical but intrigued, and Teddy pushed the thought further. What would happen if they gave these drugs to people already suffering from extreme schizophrenia? It was happening, he said, and it was legal. The only way to test treatments was on human subjects. Chuck was horrified, realizing the depth of the operation, and Teddy confirmed he was there to gather information, not to make arrests. Chuck demanded to know how he'd gotten involved, and Teddy explained the long chain of events. It had all started a year ago, with his search for Andrew Lettuce. He'd gone to Shattuck under a false pretext, only to find Lettuce had been transferred to Ashecliffe, a place with no record of him. His inquiries led to warnings, to a friend who told him the place was a black bag operation, classified. And then, a year later, he'd been assigned to this case, a stroke of what he called luck. Chuck wasn't buying it. He argued it wasn't luck at all. The institution had known Teddy was looking into them. They had tabs on him. What if they'd orchestrated the entire escape just to lure him here? Teddy dismissed the idea, pointing out they couldn't have predicted his assignment. But Chuck was insistent, his voice dropping to a low, urgent whisper. They had everything they needed, he argued. The missing wife, the fabricated patient, the story designed to hook him. They knew he would jump at any excuse to come here. They knew he'd pole vault his way across the harbor if he had to. The door wrenched itself from its single remaining hinge and crashed into the mausoleum, hammering the stone before the wind caught it and hurled it up and out of sight. The sight was so absurd, so violent, that both men could only stare. Chuck asked, with a tremor in his voice, if he'd really seen it. Teddy didn't answer. He was still in his own head, still processing the enormity of his suspicions. He asked Chuck if the thought of human experimentation bothered him. It did, Chuck admitted, but he pressed for details: who had sent Teddy, who was backing his investigation. Teddy revealed the name of a senator, a New Hampshire Democrat who chaired a mental health subcommittee, a man alarmed by the funding funneling into Ashecliffe. He told Chuck about George Noyce, a man who had been a normal college student, a little tense, a little angry, who had agreed to a test for pocket money. A year later, he was a raving schizophrenic, committed to Ashecliffe after a violent incident in Park Square. He'd been experimented on, dosed with hallucinogens until the dragons came for him. When the madness was too great, they performed surgery on him, a transorbital lobotomy, an ice pick through the eye. No anesthesia. Teddy explained the legal loophole. As long as the experimentation was framed as treatment, it was permissible. Chuck tried to wrap his head around it, but a sudden sound cut through the storm, a cry for help over a megaphone, the headlights of a jeep cutting through the graveyard. They were being found. Teddy saw the fear in Chuck's eyes, a raw, palpable terror he'd never seen there before. He offered a thin reassurance, making a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. They locked arms and stumbled toward the light. McPherson was waiting for them in the jeep, screaming in disbelief at their recklessness. The storm had been upgraded to a hurricane, with winds expected to hit 150 miles an hour by midnight. He tore across the island, the vehicle bouncing over debris, and Teddy caught glimpses of the churning sea, white and blooming like explosions. They pulled up behind Colley's mansion and roared through the main gate. McPherson told them Colley wanted to see them. Chuck cracked a joke about his mother back in Seattle, a weak attempt to break the tension. They were driven to the staff dormitory, allowed to shower in the basement, their clothes sent to the laundry. They were given plain white orderly's clothes. Chuck looked at himself in the mirror, making a wry comment about the wine list, and Trey Washington appeared, leading them to Colley. When Chuck asked how much trouble they were in, Trey offered a grim, knowing smile and said a bit. Colley greeted them warmly as they stepped into the top-floor boardroom, his mood bright and expansive, an impression Teddy took in with immediate suspicion. Leaving Trey by the door, Teddy and Chuck moved past the threshold to find a long table crowded with doctors in lab coats and suits. The room lit by green-shaded lamps and thick with smoke from cigarettes, cigars and Nearing's ever-present pipe at the head of the table. Colley introduced them as the federal marshals. A doctor immediately asked about their missing uniforms. Colley seemed to relish the question more than Teddy thought was appropriate, though Teddy himself gave the straightforward explanation they'd been caught in the storm. Another doctor gestured at the taped rain-lashed windows that seemed to pulse with the wind's pressure, genuinely incredulous that anyone would have ventured into such weather. Chuck confirmed they had. Nearing directed them to seats at the far end while the meeting concluded. A debate unfolded between Colley and Nearing over a proposed research protocol involving neuroleptics, and a test patient named Doris Walsh Colley voiced concerns about cost and neurological damage risks to the basal ganglia and cerebral cortex, citing troubling European studies, while Nearing pressed for continuation. When Nearing called for a vote, nearly every hand went up. Only Colley and one other doctor, a brown-haired man Teddy later identified as Miller, dissented. The consensus held, and Nearing closed the binder, turning his attention to the marshals. Colley fixed himself coffee, then remarked on the rumor that they'd been found in a mausoleum. Chuck deflected with a question about better hurricane shelters. Colley deadpanned that the basement would have been preferable. Chuck inquired about the storm's intensity, winds projected at 150 miles per hour, and Colley confirmed the devastation already hitting coastal towns, with Newport losing 30% of its homes, and Provincetown and Truro struck that afternoon. He described the static electricity in the air that had crippled their switchboard and radios, and warned the direct hit could level much of what remained. Nearing seized the moment to renew his demand that all Blue Zone patients, Ward C inmates, deemed dangers to themselves and others be placed in manual restraints. Colley pushed back hard, arguing that flooding would drown them if they were locked to their beds. He countered that doubling guards and constant accountability was sufficient, that the cells already contained them. Miller, the abstaining doctor, weighed in quietly, pointing out the gamble of a power failure. If the generator failed, those cells would open. Colley insisted it was still an island. There was nowhere for anyone to go, but he couldn't accept the death of 24 human beings in a flood, nor the risk to the other 42 patients if the compound itself was breached. Teddy sensed something unexpected in Colley's opposition, compassion, genuine and forceful, that made Teddy wonder if the man had any real allies in the room at all. But he interrupted to return to the matter of Rachel Solando's code. He asked about the final clue. "Who is 67? And as the doctor stared back at him blankly, Teddy laid out his deduction. There were 42 patients in wards A and B, 24 in ward C, and that total came to 66. Therefore, the question pointed to a 67th patient. Several faces showed dawning comprehension, but Naring professed confusion. Colley dismissed the idea with a patient, almost condescending explanation. Patient totals fluctuated with arrivals, deaths, discharges, and insisted that as of the night Solando wrote her code, there had been 66, including her. Teddy pressed, arguing that was exactly her point. When he requested access to patient files, the response was swift and absolute. Colley refused, Naring refused, and the assembled doctors frowned and bristled. Teddy looked down at his ridiculous white orderly's clothes. He felt like a soda jerk, lacking any authority. With no staff files and no patient files, he asked them plainly how they expected him and his partner to find their missing patient. Naring leaned back, tilting his head as if reassessing the situation, while Colley froze mid-motion, a cigarette suspended halfway to his lips. Murmurs rippled among the doctors. Teddy glanced at Chuck, who could only offer a whispered admission of bafflement. Colley finally asked if the warden had failed to inform them of something, and Teddy confirmed they'd never spoken to the warden, only McPherson had met them. Colley's reaction was one of theatrical surprise. When Teddy pressed him, Colley exhaled and revealed that Rachel Solando had been found that afternoon just down the hall. Both marshals turned instinctively toward the door, and Colley pronounced their mission complete. Colley and Naring guided them through a black-and-white tiled corridor and double doors into the main hospital ward, past a nurse's station, then into a large room lit by fluorescent tubes where curtain rods hung from ceiling hooks. There she sat on a bed in a pale green smock, dark hair freshly washed and swept back. She looked at them with a childlike expectancy, smoothing the fabric beneath her thighs. Her skin was flawless sandstone, unmarked, no scratches, no bruises, no evidence of having traveled through brush or rocks. Her bare feet were pristine. She asked how she could help. Teddy began to explain their purpose, but she interrupted, asking if they were selling something. Her husband handled those decisions. Teddy assured her they were not. She then asked what they wanted. Teddy asked about her whereabouts the previous day. She answered that she'd been home. When Colley introduced them as police officers, she grew concerned about her husband and children, but Colley and Teddy both reassured her that Jim was fine and the children were out in the yard, not in any trouble. Teddy invented a story about a known subversive distributing communist literature on her street, hoping she could account for her movements. She reacted with alarm, and when she seemed to take the inquiry as an accusation, Teddy pivoted to flattery. She was as American as Betty Grable. She demurred, but warmed when he compared her to Teresa Wright, and she spoke of her husband Jim's service in the war, how he'd returned believing the American way was the only way. Teddy affirmed he'd fought too, and she asked if he knew Jim. He admitted he didn't, but asked for her branch of service Marines, she said, and he replied with the Marine Corps motto. He explained the importance of tracing the subversives' movements, asking her to recount her own day so they could compare. She agreed readily. Tucking her legs under her as she spoke, her movements stirred something physical in Teddy's stomach and groin. She described making breakfast, packing Jim's lunch, sending the children to school, then taking a long naked swim in the lake because she'd felt kooky. After swimming until her limbs felt heavy, she'd dressed, walked the shore, skipped stones, and built sandcastles, 13 of them, some very small. When Teddy asked what she did next, she answered that she'd thought about him. The room stilled. Naring glanced at Colley with apparent surprise, and Teddy asked why her thoughts had turned to him. She smiled, with her teeth nearly closed, a small red tongue tip visible between them, and declared that Teddy was her Jim, her soldier. Rising on her knees, she took his hand and caressed it, murmuring about his roughness, his calluses, how she missed him, and he was never home. Teddy offered that he worked a lot. She tugged his arm, and Collie gave a subtle nod, urging him forward, so Teddy allowed himself to be led to the bed and sat beside her. Up close, the raw anguish that had haunted her photograph was absent, at least for the moment, and her beauty was impossible to ignore. Liquid dark eyes, limbs that moved with a languid grace through the air, a face full and soft in the lips and chin. She chided him for working too much, running her fingers below his throat as if smoothing a tie. He gave a rote answer about providing for them, and she assured him they had enough, her breath warm on his neck. When he mentioned thinking about the future, she quoted her father's saying about paying cash instead of layaway, then leaned in close, her breasts pressing against his back, advocating for living in the present. The phrase struck Teddy. It was something Dolores used to say, and the similarity in her lips and hair, her tremulous sensuality, made it almost feel like he was with his wife again. He tried to refocus, to steer her back to recounting her day, and asked what she'd done after walking the lake. She teased him, accusing him of wanting to hear her say it, and when he insisted he genuinely didn't remember, she leaned closer, her face below his, dark eyes looking up. She described coming back wet from the lake and being licked dry by him. He caught her face in his hands before she could close the remaining distance, his thumbs sliding along her temples, feeling the dampness of her hair. He whispered for her to tell him what else she'd done, and he saw something surface in her eyes. Fear, breaking through the water, clarity, spreading across her lip and brow. He felt tremors in her flesh. Her eyes widened and darted as she searched his face. She said she had buried him in an empty casket because his body had been blown across the North Atlantic, that his dog tags were all they'd found, that his beautiful body had been burned and eaten by sharks. Collie spoke her name, but she continued, describing him as meat, black and burned beyond tenderness. Teddy protested, but she insisted her Jim was dead, and demanded to know who he was. She wrenched free, crawled up the bed to the wall, and turned on him with rage, spitting and accusing him of planning to rape her while her children played outside. She lunged, hand raised, and Teddy jumped from the bed as orderlies rushed in, leather belts over their shoulders, catching her and flipping her back onto the mattress. She continued screaming accusations, calling him a rapist and threatening her husband's vengeance. The orderlies restrained her with the belts, one across her chest and one at her ankles, pulling them taut through the bedrail slots and locking the buckles with a sharp snap. Collie spoke to her gently, paternal, but she kept screaming for her babies, accusing them all, surging against her restraints hard enough to rattle the gurney. Collie said they'd check on her later. She spat at him, and as they left, Teddy glanced back to see her straining against the belts, blood on her lip, shrieking as if the centuries dead were climbing through her window. In Collie's office, Teddy asked where they'd found her on the beach near the lighthouse, skipping stones. But as Collie moved across the room, Teddy lost him behind a film of white gauze, and he knew the migraine was beginning. He rubbed his right eye to no effect, feeling a canyon of pain open along the left side of his skull, dagger points pushing into his cranium. Collie noticed his pallor and asked if he was all right. Teddy managed a weak reply, but the sound of a Scotch glass on the desk hit his ears like a gunshot. Collie told him to sit, and Teddy tried to insist he was fine, but his words struggled down a spiked ladder. Collie leaned over him, the bones in his body crackling, and correctly identified the migraine from the way Teddy rubbed his temple. Teddy confirmed he got them 6 times a year, and Collie remarked that he was lucky some people suffered cluster migraines weekly. As Collie came off the desk and unlocked a cabinet, Teddy heard the sound of wood burning. He asked Collie about his specific symptoms, vision loss, dry mouth, pain, and Teddy confirmed each one. Collie mused on the mystery of migraines, how they attack the parietal lobe and caused blood clotting, yet despite centuries of study, no one understood their cause or long-term effects any better than they understood the common cold. He handed Teddy a glass of water and 2 yellow pills, promising they would knock him out for an hour or two and leave him clear-headed upon waking. Teddy stared at the pills, then up at Collie, who appeared bathed in a harsh white light that seemed to radiate from his shoulders. A voice began in Teddy's head, but before it could finish, fingernails pried open the left side of his skull and poured in thumbtacks. He hissed, sucking in breath. Chuck and Collie exchanged words nearby, but Teddy could barely register them. The voice tried again, only to be drowned out as someone hammered a steel rod through the field of thumbtacks. He pressed his hand to his good eye as tears burst forth and his stomach heaved. The voice screamed at him not to take the pills. Flames licked the fissure in his head, and he vomited onto the floor. Chuck and Collie responded, but Teddy could only raise his head, cheeks wet with tears as the voice continued its desperate refrain. A blade had been inserted lengthwise into the canyon and was sawing back and forth. He gritted his teeth, stomach surging again. Through the haze, he noticed something odd on his thumb, but dismissed it as the migraine playing tricks. The voice grew more frantic, and with another excruciating pull of the saw, Teddy bit down against a scream. Rachel's screams mixed with the fire, her face in his hands, her breath on his lips. He slapped his palm to his mouth, felt the pills fly back in, swallowed them with water, and drained the glass. Collie assured him he'd be grateful. Chuck handed him a handkerchief, and Teddy wiped his forehead and mouth before dropping it. They helped him up, and Collie led him to a black door, revealing a small room where he sometimes napped. Teddy looked down at his hands hanging over his sternum, noticing black smudges on both thumbs. Shoe polish, he thought, as they guided him into darkness. The dreams that followed were the worst he'd ever experienced. He walked through the empty streets of his hometown, Hull, passing familiar landmarks, the schoolhouse, the variety store, the houses of neighbors he'd known his whole life, but found no one. The town was deserted, silent. The ocean itself, gone silent. He sat on the seawall, waiting, realizing everyone was dead, that he was a ghost in a ghost town. Then he found himself in a marble hall filled with people, gurneys, and red var bags, and he felt relief at not being alone. 3 children in hospital smocks crossed his path, 2 boys and a girl clutching her brother's hands, afraid of someone who would find them. Andrew Lettuce appeared to light his cigarette, a grotesque figure with a gnarled body and misshapen features, but Teddy was glad to see a familiar face. Lettuce offered him a bottle, winked, clapped his back, and then turned into Chuck, who urged them to move because time was running out. Teddy mentioned his empty town, but then Rachel Solando came shrieking through the ballroom with a cleaver, tackling the children before Teddy could reach them. He watched, frozen and morbidly fascinated, as she swung the cleaver again and again. She looked up, her face speckled with blood, and asked for his help, promising to become Dolores if he would. He agreed, and together they carried the 3 children out the back door to a lake, laying them gently on the water, where they began to sink. One of the boys surfaced, a hand flailing, and Rachel assured Teddy it was fine the boy couldn't swim. They watched from the shore as he sank, and she put her arm around Teddy's waist, proposing that he would be her Jim, and she would be his Dolores, and they would make new babies. The solution struck Teddy as perfectly just, and he wondered why he'd never considered it before. He followed her back into Ashecliffe, where they met Chuck, and the 3 of them walked a corridor that stretched endlessly. Teddy told Chuck she was taking him to Dolores, that he was going home. Chuck expressed his happiness for him, admitting he would never leave the island himself, he belonged there. When Teddy confused Rachel with Dolores, Chuck corrected him gently. Teddy apologized, then asked if Chuck truly believed he belonged here. Chuck nodded, saying he'd never left, and never would he told Teddy to look at his hands, which Teddy found perfectly normal, but Chuck insisted they didn't fit, and sometimes his fingers turned into mice. Teddy accepted this, and said he was glad Chuck was home. Chuck clapped his back and turned into Collie while Rachel had moved far ahead. Teddy hurried after her. Collie argued that he couldn't love a woman who killed her children, but Teddy insisted he could. He couldn't face being alone. Collie pressed, but Teddy maintained that the deal was good. She would be his Dolores. He would be her Jim. Then Collie warned him, and the 3 children came running back down the corridor, soaking wet and screaming. Collie questioned what kind of mother would do that, and Teddy watched the children run in place, unable to advance. When Collie repeated the question about killing kids, Teddy defended her, saying she was just scared, she didn't mean it. But Collie had transformed into Peter Breen, challenging Teddy's logic. Teddy placed his service revolver to Peter's temple and, with tears streaming, spoke of all the people he'd executed. Peter begged him not to, but Teddy pulled the trigger, watching the bullet exit the other side. The children screamed, and Peter leaned against the wall, holding his wound and complaining about the violence in front of the children. Then they heard her shriek from the darkness ahead. She was coming. The little girl pleaded for help. Teddy told her he wasn't her father, but she said she'd call him Daddy, and he sighed and took her hand. They walked the cliffs above the shore and wandered into the cemetery, where Teddy found bread and made sandwiches in the mausoleum. The girl sat on his lap, happy, eating. Later, he took her into the graveyard and showed her the headstones of his parents and his own Edward Daniels, bad sailor 1920 to 1957. She asked why he was a bad sailor, and he said he didn't like water. She agreed, saying that made them friends. She noted they were both dead, and he apologized, acknowledging he couldn't stop what had happened to her. Then Rachel appeared at the headstone he'd knocked over in the storm, beautiful with wet hair, carrying an axe instead of a cleaver. She demanded the children back. Teddy refused, and she promised it would be different this time, that she had her head right. He wept, professing his love, and she kissed him deeply. Then she asked for the girl, and he handed her over. She said she'd be right back, and Teddy waved to the girl, believing the sacrifice was for her own good, even as she stared at him with resigned eyes. He woke with a start, crying, feeling like he'd torn himself from the nightmare. In the darkness, Collie's voice asked how he was, then turned on a lamp. Teddy learned he'd been out for 4 hours. Collie noted he'd been having serious nightmares, and asked who Dolores was, because Teddy kept saying her name. Teddy swung his legs off the bed, complained of dry mouth, accepted water, and took stock of his head, vision clear. No pain, just a mild ache like an old bruise. When Collie asked again about Dolores, Teddy confirmed she was his dead wife, and admitted he was still coming to terms with it. Collie expressed sympathy and asked if her death had been sudden. Teddy laughed at the question. Teddy brushed off the suggestion of psychoanalysis, but Collie pressed gently, noting that something had passed between him and Rachel in that room, something beyond the patient's delusions. As her therapist, he'd be negligent not to wonder about Teddy's own demons. Teddy insisted he was just playing the role she wanted, but Collie challenged that, hinting at what might have happened if they'd been left alone. Teddy bristled, asserting his authority as an officer of the law, and Collie backed down, though his silence was pointed. Finally, Teddy offered a piece of himself. His wife had died in a fire, and he missed her with an intensity he compared to needing oxygen underwater. Collie, in turn, shared a story about a woman he'd loved in France during the war, Marie, who had died in a senseless accident, tripping on a rainy Paris street and hitting her head. The absurdity of it still haunted him, and he confessed that if he could find a portal to wherever her soul had gone, he'd climb in after her. Teddy reciprocated with a memory of Dolores's restless sleep, how her hand would flop across his face, and how sometimes he'd leave it there just to breathe her in. He'd sell the world to have that hand back over his face. The room rumbled with wind, and Collie watched Teddy carefully before asking if he'd ever considered he might be suicidal. Teddy admitted he had. It why he'd stopped drinking, knowing he'd have eaten his gun long ago if he hadn't. Collie offered names of doctors who could help, but Teddy refused, citing the professional risk if it ever leaked. Collie pressed, warning that if Teddy kept his current course, it wasn't a matter of if but when. He specialized in grief trauma and survivor's guilt, and he'd seen the desire to die in Teddy's eyes when he'd looked at Rachel. Collie noted Teddy's war record, his medals, his presence at Dachau, and asked how much violence a man could carry before breaking. Teddy admitted he wasn't sure. Collie clapped his knee and urged him to take those names before he left, wanting to know Teddy was still in the world 5 years from now. Teddy said softly that he would too. Later, in the basement of the men's dormitory, Teddy found Chuck. He'd arrived through underground corridors connecting the buildings, led by an orderly named Ben through locked gates and checkpoints, the dim gray halls uncomfortably reminiscent of his dream corridor. Seeing Chuck brought an unexpected relief. He'd wanted to come alone, but after the mausoleum, Rachel's kiss, and the nightmares, he was glad not to be alone. They shook hands, and Teddy remembered Chuck's dream confession about never leaving the island, and something fluttered in his chest. Chuck asked how he was doing. Teddy admitted he was better but shaky. Chuck confessed he'd been scared, thinking Teddy was having a heart attack or stroke. He lowered his voice, away from the other men, and admitted that at first he'd thought Teddy was faking it to get to the files. Teddy wished he'd been that smart. Chuck's eyes glimmered as he revealed he'd acted on that thought after Colley left the office. He'd gone after his files. Chuck's face fell as he admitted he hadn't found much. The file cabinets had locks he'd never seen before, and while he could have picked them, it would have left marks. Teddy agreed. He'd done the right thing, but Chuck had gotten into the desk, finding only a calendar. Yesterday, today, tomorrow, and the next day were all blocked off in black, not for the hurricane, but with a single notation across the 4 boxes. Patient 67. That single phrase was enough. Trey Washington ambled over, wet and smoking a ratty stogie, asking what they were up to. He'd been out sandbagging the compound in the brutal storm and had heard rumors about Teddy's attack. Teddy explained it was just migraines, and Trey shared a story about his mean aunt, who'd suffered similarly. Chuck offered the advice to run faster, and Trey laughed before heading off to dry himself. The room filled with men shaking off rain, smoking, passing flasks. Leaning against the wall, Teddy and Chuck confirmed the calendar's words. Patient 67. Teddy couldn't sleep that night, lying awake in the dark, listening to the men's breathing and the storm outside. He replayed Colley's words about suicide. Not if, but when, and acknowledged to himself that he'd thought of joining Dolores every day since her death. Sometimes it felt cowardly to keep living, going through the motions of a life that brought him no closer to her. He was supposed to move on, but how could he put her on a shelf, let her gather dust until she was less a person and more a dream? He wanted to hold her again, smell her, and yet he also wanted her to fade. The conflict tore at him. Wide awake at 3 a.m, he heard her voice. The faint Boston accent in her whispered, "For Ava and Ava," and smiled in the dark, remembering her teeth, her eyelashes, her Sunday morning glances. He drifted back to the night he'd met her at the Coconut Grove, the silver air thick with smoke. Everyone dressed to the nines, the music brassy and alive. He'd been there with Frankie Gordon but abandoned him the moment he saw her. A flash of violet dress worn nervously, self-consciously, as if she'd never worn anything so fine. It was borrowed or rented, and she couldn't be sure if people looked at her with lust, envy, or pity. She caught him watching, dropped her eyes, then looked back up. He smiled, willing the thought that he felt just as stupid in his own get-up, and she smiled back gratefully. He left Frankie mid-sentence and crossed the dance floor, realizing he had nothing to say. She asked if he was lost, and he said he was looking for her. The words came out before he could stop them, and he cringed at how smooth and full of himself he must have sounded. But she just looked at him, and somehow it was all right. He'd wanted to run, couldn't bear to look at her another second, but she spoke first. At least he hadn't had to walk far. A goofy grin broke across his face, and he felt like an oaf, too happy to breathe. He agreed he hadn't. She leaned back, martini glass pressed to her chest, and observed that he was as out of place as she was. Later, leaning into the cab window as she sat in back with her friend Linda, he said her name. She called him Edward, and he laughed. No one called him that but his mother. She offered Teddy instead, and he loved hearing her say it. She tried it out again, and he asked her last name. Shano, she said, and he raised an eyebrow. She acknowledged it sounded highfalutin and didn't fit her. He asked if he could call her. She asked if he had a head for numbers, and he admitted he did. She gave him her number, and he stood on the sidewalk as the cab pulled away, her face an inch from his, the memory nearly short-circuiting his brain. He thought, this is what it feels like to love. No logic to it. He barely knew her, but he'd just met the woman he'd known since before he was born, the measure of every dream he'd never dared indulge. Dolores. Everything he'd ever needed. And now, it had a name. Back on his cot, Teddy reached for his notebook and a box of matches. He lit matches off his thumb, working through 4 before he'd assigned the proper letters to the numbers from the storm, RADIEDS, ALDWNE. Once that was done, unscrambling was quick. Another 2 matches, and he stared at the name as the flame crept toward his fingers. Andrew Lettuce. He glanced at Chuck sleeping nearby, and hoped his career wouldn't suffer. Teddy would take all the blame. Chuck should emerge unscathed. The match blew out, but he'd seen enough. He was going to find Lettuce, and he was going to kill him. Morning revealed the storm's damage. The wardens in Cawley's homes had taken direct hits. Half of Cawley's roof was gone, tiles scattered across the grounds, and a tree had crashed through the warden's living room window. The compound lay under 1.5 inches of water, littered with shells, branches, dead rats, and soggy apples. The hospital's foundation looked jackhammered. Warda had lost windows and flashing. Staff cottages were reduced to sticks or lay on their sides. Dormitories had water damage, but Ward B was untouched. Trees across the island had their tops snapped off like spears. The air was dead. The rain a tired drizzle, dead fish covering the shore. A single flounder still flapped in the breezeway. Teddy and Chuck watched McPherson and a guard ride a jeep. It started on the 5th try, and they roared off toward Ward C. Cawley walked through the compound, picking up a piece of his roof and staring at it before dropping it back. He almost approached them, but was intercepted by a doctor with a stethoscope, who reported that backup generator number 2 was dead, and they had 2 critical patients who would die without power. Cawley asked about Harry, but the doctor said Harry couldn't get a charge. What good was a backup if it didn't back anything up? Cawley and the doctor strode into the hospital. Teddy and Chuck exchanged observations. The generator had failed, and with no lights visible, the whole electrical system might be fried. That would mean fences. The apple drifted onto his shoe, and he scooped it up, wound his arm back, and kicked it hard against the wall in a single fluid motion. He turned, a sly grin on his face, and remarked that the fences were likely back in action. Teddy agreed, adding that it probably meant all the electronic security, the gates, the doors were live again. His partner let out a dramatic sigh, catching another apple and tossing it behind his back with a show of dexterity. He then asked if Teddy was planning to go into the fort. Teddy tipped his face into the drizzle and declared the weather perfect for it. Just then, the warden's jeep splashed into the yard, flanked by guards. The man's gaze swept over them, and Teddy could see the irritation flicker across his face. He mistook them for orderlies standing idle, and it clearly rankled him. But the warden drove on, his attention snapping forward to more pressing matters. Teddy realized he'd never heard the man speak, and found himself wondering if his voice would match the severe pallor of his skin or the deep black of his hair. Chuck suggested they move, and Teddy started for the gate. His partner caught up, muttering about a dry mouth and jokingly undercutting his own bravado. When Teddy asked if he was scared, Chuck's reply came back as a blunt, nervous admission. At the gate, a young guard with a cruel set to his eyes ordered them to report for cleanup duty. They exchanged a look, their white uniforms and lack of tools making them conspicuous. With a bit of verbal misdirection about lunch, Teddy flashed his badge, explaining their clothes were still in the laundry. The guard checked the badge, then waited for Chuck to produce his own identification. When the guard questioned their business outside the wall, Teddy saw the risk in offering any explanation. It would only make them seem weak. He knew the type: you couldn't reason with him, but you could bully him. He stepped closer, fixing the guard with a flat stare, and said they were taking a stroll. The guard objected, citing a lack of authorization. Teddy leaned in, his voice dropping low, and delivered a quiet, brutal assertion of federal authority, the implication of what they could do to him if he didn't comply, and the guard's resolve crumbled. He stammered his agreement, and Teddy made him say it louder. With a final sharp exhale and the old army cry, he walked through the gate without a backward glance. Once outside, Chuck commented on the tactic, and Teddy admitted he'd used it often in the war. He'd learned that you commanded respect through fear, not pleasantries. Chuck made a joke about them infiltrating a fort, and they traded light-hearted barbs about moats and archers as they stepped over a fallen tree and glimpsed the fort's walls ahead, crisscrossed with jeep tracks. Chuck then raised a more serious point without their official authority. They'd have no cover if they were caught. Teddy felt the weight of exhaustion and the previous night's drugged sleep pressing on him. The drizzle soaked his hat, and a dull buzz clouded his thoughts. He considered the futility of returning to Boston empty-handed, having failed both his mission and his personal quest. He pulled out his notebook, showed Chuck the broken code from the rock piles, confirming Lettuce was indeed the unnamed 67th patient. At a muddy outcropping, Teddy gave Chuck an out, but Chuck insisted that marshals go through the doors. They didn't wait for backup. From the edge of the tree line they got a clear view of the fort and saw its fence was a wreck, sections flattened, others torn away, and the rest sagging uselessly. Armed guards and orderlies patrolled and worked the perimeter. The only entrance was a small iron door under the watch of guards on the battlements. An idea occurred to Teddy. He touched his collar, pointing out they weren't dressed like marshals, and nodded at the orderlies working nearby. Chuck caught on, and with a grin he saw the plan. They could just walk in. They strode across the field, confident and casual, and when a guard met them they gave a simple, vague explanation about being sent to work on the roof. The guard, dismissing them, waved them past without a second thought. Walking through the door, Teddy felt a flicker of uneasy luck, but he pushed the thought aside and stepped into the shadow of the fort. They walked the rest of the way to the fort, smoking and trading nonsense chatter to keep up the pretense. A guard met them in the field, his rifle loose and harmless. Teddy gave him a story about being sent for roof work, but the guard dismissed it, saying that was already handled. Chuck made as if to leave, but the guard called them back, insisting there was still plenty to do. Teddy pointed out the dozens of men already working the wall, but the guard explained the inside was a wreck the storm had gotten in, as storms do. They reached the iron door and Chuck, affecting the voice of authority, asked where the mop detail was. The guard opened the door, and they stepped into the receiving hall. Chuck murmured that it had been too easy, and Teddy waved it off, calling it luck. But Chuck's voice carried a thin tremor as he repeated the word back. Inside, the smell hit Teddy first, a brutal cocktail of industrial disinfectant, failing to mask the deeper human reek of vomit, sweat, and the sharp sting of urine. Then the noise came, a chaotic chorus of running feet, muffled shouts, and pained yelps that echoed off the stone. Somewhere, a man was still counting down bottles of beer on the wall, his song drifting from the upper floors. A guard sat at a table near the stairs, and he offered a knowing smile, asking if it was their first time. Teddy admitted as much, and the guard assured them you got used to it. He directed them to the roof, warning them to steer clear of any loose patients. These weren't like the ones in Ward A. They were killers. As they started up the stairs, the guard called them back with a sing-song voice, claiming he recognized them. Teddy froze. The guard laughed, and identified them as the unlucky bastards stuck with roof detail, and they played along, a forced exchange of banter before they continued climbing. At the first landing they faced a cavernous hall, its copper ceiling arching high above a floor so polished it gleamed like a mirror. The space was vast and empty, a gate standing ajar at the far end. The room stirred an uneasy memory in Teddy, a dream of Lettuce and Rachel Solando. He could feel the sweat bead on his neck as Chuck whispered that this was a setup. The hall was too quiet, too unprotected. Teddy started across the floor, his head throbbing from exhaustion and the churning noise of the building. Visions from his nightmares flickered before him, the children, the pills Collie had given him. He could feel the nausea eddy in his stomach. At the far end a man appeared in the doorway, barefoot, bare-chested and bald. He called out a cheerful greeting, then just as quickly disappeared, shouting a game of tag. Teddy walked faster. They reached a central landing. One stairwell plunged into darkness, the other rose toward the clamor of chains and voices, and then, suddenly, the bald man was beside Teddy, inches from his face, tapping his arm and declaring him it. Teddy held his ground and returned the gesture. The man launched into a rambling monologue about Soviet submarines lurking off the coast, their rockets aimed at the cities. It was a dizzying, paranoid fever dream, and Teddy chose not to engage, offering only the simplest answers. The man nodded, stroking his stubble, and continued muttering about hydrogen bombs, implosions, and the terrible power of self-destruction. The more he spoke, the more his words spiraled into a frantic, almost gleeful warning. He tapped Teddy's arm again, declared him hit to the 10th degree, and with a final manic shout, he vanished down the dark stairwell. The man's voice took on a sing-song quality as he tried to explain not simply a bomb that exploded, but one that imploded, collapsing into itself in a cascade of internal breakdowns. With each collapse, he said, it grew denser, more massive, birthing a new kind of monster from its own destruction. The larger the breakdown, he claimed, the more devastating the explosion that followed. 100, 1,000, 1,000,000 times more powerful than anything before it. He tapped Teddy's arm in a quick rhythm, declared him it to the 10th degree, and with a final gleeful yell, vanished down the dark stairwell, still shouting. Teddy turned to Chuck, saw the dampness on his face, and agreed they needed to leave. But before they could move, a cry for help came from above. They looked up to see a guard and a patient tumbling down the stairs in a violent tangle, slamming to a halt on the landing. The patient had one hand free and dug his fingers into the guard's face, tearing at the flesh. Teddy and Chuck sprinted up the steps. The patient lunged again, but Chuck caught his wrist. The guard scrambled free, blood smearing his chin. Teddy saw the patient rear up, mouth wide, and he shouted a warning, slamming his palm into the man's forehead to stop him from biting Chuck's arm. He told the guard to get clear, then pinned the patient's shoulder to the stone. A baton sliced through the air, breaking the patient's nose, and the man went limp. Teddy blocked another swing from the guard, yelling that the patient was out cold, but the guard, smelling his own blood, seemed ready to strike again. Chuck's voice cut through, sharp and commanding, ordering him to stand down. The guard finally lowered the baton, pressing a hand to his torn face, and Teddy assured him the wound would heal with a few stitches. Above them, the sounds of a struggle suggested a full-scale riot was brewing. The guard admitted it was close, but they hadn't lost control yet. Chuck handed over his handkerchief, then checked the patient's pulse and pupils, confirming he was alive. They lifted the man between them and followed the guard up the long staircase. At the top, the guard turned and recognized them as the marshals he'd seen them arrive. He asked what they were doing inside, and Teddy gave a blunt answer, saving his face. The guard revealed the patient's brutal history. A man who had killed his brother's family and confessed, with red-rimmed eyes, that the man had nearly had him. Teddy shook his hand, introduced himself, and said they were just taking a quick look around before leaving. The guard paused, and Teddy felt the weight of everything he'd been through in the past 2 years, all the loss, the searching, the waiting, hanging on this kid's next move. The guard finally spoke, saying he'd worked rough places, but this one was something else entirely. They'd written their own playbook. After a long, searching stare, he agreed to let them have a few minutes. As he reached for the door, he offered a wry piece of advice: try not to die in the meantime. They passed through the door into a long cell block of granite, the walls and floor stretching the length of the fort under tall archways. Dim light filtered through windows at either end, and the ceiling wept moisture, pooling in puddles on the floor. The cells flanked them, swallowed in shadow. Baker explained that the main generator had failed at 4 a.m, releasing all the electronic locks. They'd managed to secure most patients manually, but someone kept slipping in and reopening at least one cell. Teddy asked if the culprit was a bald man, and Baker confirmed it, a patient named Litchfield. Teddy mentioned seeing him playing tag in the lower stairwell. They carried the unconscious patient to a cell, laying him on a bed in the dark. Baker shone a flashlight on the man's bloody face and said he needed backup to hunt down Litchfield before the basement patients, the truly dangerous ones, got loose. Chuck insisted he get medical help first, and after a moment Baker agreed, locking the cell and jogging off. Alone in the dim corridor, Teddy and Chuck discussed their next move. Chuck suggested searching for patient files, and they agreed to split up for 15 minutes, Meeting back in the main hall, Teddy watched Chuck disappear through the door, then fell in with two orderlies who had spotted the shadowboxing patient. They called him Willie, a delusional boxer who thought he was training for a fight. The orderlies coaxed him into a cell with talk of a massage, and Teddy continued on with one of them, a tall, older man named Al. Al asked why Teddy was dressed for the outside, and Teddy said he'd chased a patient in from the roof. A wad of filth splattered near his foot, and he kept his eyes forward as Al advised him to stay in the middle of the corridor. He asked if Teddy had found his man, but before Teddy could answer, Al spotted a small, soaking wet redhead sprinting toward them. The guards gave chase, and Al joined the pursuit. Teddy hesitated, then heard a whisper from the darkness. "Lettuce." He stood still, waiting. The whisper came again, fractured. He turned to face 3 cells on his right, all dark. A voice not Lettuce's, but familiar, accused him of failing to save him. Teddy approached the center cell and struck a match. Inside, a gaunt man knelt on his bed, writing on the wall. He looked back, annoyed, and said he preferred to work in the dark. Teddy backed away, noticing the cell's walls were covered in thousands of lines of cramped, precise script. The match went out. The voice, closer now, said he'd failed, that he'd promised freedom. Teddy fumbled with another match, but it snapped. The next one flew away unlit. The voice accused him again. "You lied." The match caught with a sizzle, flaring bright over Teddy's finger as he held it to the bars. Inside, a man sat hunched in the corner, his face buried between his knees, arms wrapped tight around his calves. Bald on top with salt and pepper at the sides, he was stripped to his boxer shorts and his whole frame trembled. Teddy called out a greeting, but the man only muttered that they'd taken him back, claimed he was theirs. Teddy asked him to raise his head to show his face, but the man insisted this was his home now, that he'd never leave. When Teddy pressed again, the man's voice grew bitter, accusing him of being a liar, of breaking a promise. He mentioned their past conversations, hinting at a friendship that had soured. The match burned down to Teddy's fingers, and he dropped it, plunging the cell back into darkness. From the right side of the cell, a voice whispered, "Lettuce" again, then added that this was never about the truth. Teddy lit 2 more matches together. The bed was empty. He swept the light to the corner and found the man standing, his back turned. When the man spun around, his face was a ruin. Purple, black, and cherry red, his nose broken and taped in a white X. Teddy recognized him. George Noyce. Noyce accused Teddy of doing this to him, of being the reason he was back in this place. Teddy denied it, insisting his goal had been to expose the institution, but Noyce cut him off, yelling that Teddy had only ever planned to kill Lettuce. His voice was raw, desperate. Teddy tried to calm him, asking for details about how he'd been returned, but Noyce just laughed and spat in his face. He then revealed that Colley's true specialty wasn't grief or survivor's guilt. It was violence. Colley was studying male violence, bringing in the most dangerous patients from across the country. No one would question the transfer paperwork for someone with a history of violence and mental illness. Noyce's voice broke as he said he'd never get out again. He'd escaped once, but not twice. Teddy asked how they'd found him, and Noyce insisted they knew everything. It was all a stage play, a game designed for Teddy. Teddy scoffed, pointing out the absurdity of staging a hurricane, but Noyce fell silent. Then Noyce asked if Teddy had been truly alone since this began. Teddy said he had his partner, Chuck. Noyce pressed further, and Teddy admitted he'd never worked with Chuck before. He tried to explain that he trusted him anyway, but Noyce simply said that if that were true, they'd already won. Noyce began to weep, begging Teddy not to let him die there. He said they were going to take him to the lighthouse, to cut out his brain. Teddy lit his final match and saw Noyce gripping the bars, tears streaming down his swollen face. Teddy started to assure him they wouldn't, but the words caught in his throat. Teddy promised Noyce he would go to the lighthouse, see what was there, and come back to tell him. He swore he would get him out. Noyce pressed his scalp to the bars and wept silently, and Teddy remembered their last meeting in prison, when Noyce had said he'd kill himself rather than return to this place. Teddy had assured him it wouldn't happen, a lie. now made brutally clear. He told Noyce to hold on, not to do anything irreversible. Noyce looked up, his face streaked with tears, and shook his head slowly. He said Teddy couldn't kill Lettuce and expose the truth at the same time. He had to choose. Teddy insisted he wouldn't kill anyone, that saving Noyce was enough. But Noyce called him a liar, and told him to let his wife go. Teddy felt the words hit him like a physical blow, and he admitted he couldn't. Noyce leaned back, his head cocked, and said if Teddy couldn't let her go, he'd never leave the island. Then, with a weary sigh, he revealed that Lettuce had been transferred out of Ward C. If he wasn't in Ward A, there was only one place he could be. Teddy understood the lighthouse. The match died, and Teddy stood in the dark for a long moment before hearing Noyce lie down. He turned to leave, and Noyce's voice followed him, offering a quiet benediction. As Teddy walked back through the cell block, he found Al waiting. They walked together, and Teddy's mind drifted to Noyce's question about being alone. He thought back over his 3 days on the island, trying to find a moment when he'd been truly by himself, but there was always someone nearby, even in the bathroom. Then there was Chuck. He considered what he actually knew about his partner. Chuck was instantly likable from Seattle, a great poker player with a scar from a childhood slingshot accident. But there was something off, a moment of clumsiness Teddy couldn't quite place. Still, he trusted him. Chuck had broken into Colley's desk after all. They reached the door, and Al gave him directions to the roof before disappearing back into the block. Teddy opened the door, found the landing empty, and turned to go down the stairs only to see Chuck waiting at the curve, smoking nervously. Chuck said they had to move. The warden and Colley were in the building, and he'd nearly been spotted coming out of the records room. They hurried through the vast hall as the power flickered back on, the lights crackling to life and setting off alarms throughout the fort. They descended the stairs, slipping past guards, but a guard at the card table called out to them as they reached the foyer. They pushed through the crowd, ignoring his shouts, and Teddy shouldered the heavy door open, letting Chuck pass through before following him out into the rain. They spotted a cluster of men in identical uniforms, lounging against the wall, smoking and joking in the light drizzle. Teddy and Chuck merged into the group, blending in with nods and waves. Teddy got a light from one of them, and they kept moving along the wall, aware of the guards on the battlements above and the potential shouts behind them. The wall seemed to stretch forever, but they finally reached its end and turned into a soggy field, only to find sections of the fence already replaced, men pouring cement into fresh post holes. The way back was sealed off. They doubled back, emerging into the open, and Teddy realized their only option was to walk straight past the guards. They removed their hats and slickers, draping them over their arms, and strode forward with forced casualness. The same guard from before was waiting, his face unreadable. Teddy waved as they passed, and the guard mentioned that trucks were now available to take them back. Teddy declined, saying they needed the exercise. For a moment, something flickered in the guard's expression, perhaps suspicion, but he let them go. They reached the trees, and no one followed. Deep in the cover of the woods, Chuck let out a breath, and Teddy collapsed onto a boulder, his body soaked with sweat and exhilaration. He felt the raw joy of escape, a feeling he hadn't known since childhood. He lay back, watching the sky clear through the smoky clouds, and let the sounds and smells of the wet earth wash over him. But the exhaustion crept in, and he sat up, lighting a cigarette. He told Chuck they had to assume they'd been identified, that their presence in the fort would be remembered. Chuck agreed, and the distant foghorn from Boston Light cut through the air, a sound Teddy had known since childhood, heavy with loneliness. Chuck pressed him about Noyce, and Teddy recounted the encounter, the beating, the fear, the accusations, leaving out Noyce's suspicions about Chuck. Chuck listened, then questioned the possibility that Noyce had suffered a genuine psychological break in prison, leading to his return. Teddy conceded it was possible, but he'd seen Noyce a month ago, and he'd been sane. The conversation turned to the lighthouse. Chuck dismissed the idea of mad scientists, calling it all a bit theatrical, too much like a horror story. Teddy admitted he didn't know what the word meant, and Chuck explained it was a French term for that kind of grotesque spectacle. Teddy then asked with a pointed edge if Chuck had studied French growing up in Portland. Chuck corrected him, Seattle. Teddy pressed further, mentioning a man he'd known in the Seattle office, a Joe Fairfield. Chuck didn't recognize the name. Teddy let it drop, but he noticed the awkwardness in Chuck's movements as he reached for the paper in his back pocket, a clumsiness he'd seen before. Chuck held out Lettuce's intake form, but Teddy told him to keep it. He said he'd look at it later, letting the silence stretch between them. Chuck finally stood, returning the paper to his pocket, and they resumed walking. Chuck's response came in fragments of reluctant agreement, and Teddy set off east through the woods. Chuck called after him, pointing out that Ashecliffe was in the opposite direction. Teddy turned back and smiled, declaring their destination was the lighthouse. Lost in the storm-tangled woods, they emerged well north of the lighthouse fence. The landscape had become a muddy bayou, forcing them to weave around downed trees, and Teddy estimated they'd drifted almost as far as the cemetery. The lighthouse itself was visible, its upper third peeking over a rise but a tidal marsh, and jagged rocks blocked their path. He suggested backtracking through the woods to find the correct turn. Chuck proposed a different approach loop around from the east, following what might be an access road. It was a better plan, and they started walking, the tension between them palpable after an hour of silence. Teddy watched Chuck's back, and wondered why he trusted this man. He'd told Noyce he did, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized he'd had no choice. He couldn't face this alone. Senator Hurley would make inquiries if he vanished, but would his voice be heard? The marshals would come, but would they be too late? They reached a narrow promontory, the sea dropping sharply on one side, a scrub plain below them on the other. Another set of rock piles lay there, 9 piles in 3 rows. Chuck argued they should ignore them. The sun was fading, and they had proof. Lettuce was here. They should head back. Teddy countered that the rocks could be a code, and Chuck's reluctance only deepened his suspicion. Teddy climbed down, counted the rocks, and wrote the numbers in his notebook, adding their alphabetical equivalents. He climbed back up, exhausted and hungry, and found the sky had turned bronze. He knew Chuck had been right. They'd wasted time. Even if they reached the lighthouse, what would they find? If Chuck was working against him, it would be a trap. He crested the hill, hauled himself onto the promontory, and lay there for a moment, breathing in the sea air. He felt small, but part of something vast, oddly proud. Then he looked across the flat stone and realized, with a sudden chill, that Chuck was no longer there. From the promontory's edge, Teddy spotted the dark shape below, and his chest seized Chuck's body, lying where the water met the rocks. He swung his legs over the lip, testing each black stone with the soles of his shoes before committing his weight. A sharp exhale escaped him as his elbows left the ledge, and he felt the rocks settle beneath him, one shifting, his ankle twisting with it. He slapped his palm flat against the cliff face, throwing his upper body back into the stone until the footing held. Then he turned, pressing himself crab-like to the rock, and began the descent. It was painstaking work. Some stones were anchored deep, immovable. Others balanced precariously on those below, betraying nothing, until he trusted them with his full weight. 10 minutes down, he spotted a half-smoked Lucky Chuck's brand. It's cold dead, and sharp as a carpenter's pencil. What could have sent him over? The breeze was there, but not forceful enough to sweep a man from solid ground. Teddy pictured Chuck alone on that ledge in his final moments, and the image pried open a door he kept bolted. Everyone he'd lost while he was forced to keep breathing. Dolores, his father, somewhere on this same ocean floor, his mother at 16, Tutti Vaselli in Sicily, that curious smile on his face as blood spilled from his mouth. Martin Phelan, Jason Hill, Yardak Gilobialski, the big Polish machine gunner from Pittsburgh, who'd made them all laugh in Belgium until a leg wound wouldn't stop bleeding, and Frankie Gordon, left behind at the Coconut Grove dead 2 years later when he stepped on a mine after Teddy had flicked a cigarette off his helmet and called him a shitbird. Teddy still carried shrapnel from that blast in his calf. "Now, Chuck!" Had he made a mistake in trusting him? Should he have given him more room for doubt? Chuck had made him laugh, made these 3 impossible days bearable. Just that morning he'd been joking about eggs Benedict and Reuben sandwiches. Teddy glanced back at the promontory lip. He was halfway down now, the sky deepening to the same blue-black as the sea. What could have pitched Chuck off that ledge? Nothing natural unless he'd dropped something and tried to retrieve it. Unless, like Teddy, he'd attempted to climb down on shifting stone. He paused, sweat dripping from his face, and carefully wiped one hand dry on his pants, then the other. As he gripped a pointed shard of rock, he noticed a piece of paper wedged nearby, fluttering in the sea air. He pinched it between his fingers and knew immediately what it was: lettuce's intake form. He slid it into his back pocket, understanding now why Chuck had come down here for this paper. For him. The final 20 feet were boulders, massive black eggs slick with kelp. Teddy turned, lowering himself backward on his hands, working his way across them, past rats hiding in the crevices. When he reached the shore, he spotted Chuck's body and walked toward it, only to realize it was a long white rock draped in black seaweed. Relief flooded through him. Chuck was alive somewhere. He cupped his hands and called Chuck's name, again and again, his voice carrying out to sea and bouncing off the rocks. He waited, straining to see a head appear over the promontory, but darkness had swallowed the cliff's top. He called, until his throat burned, then fell silent, listening. The breeze, the rats in the rocks, a gull's cry, the ocean's lap, and finally the mournful foghorn from Boston Light. As his eyes adjusted to the dark, he saw them dozens of eyes watching from the boulders. Rats, hundreds of them now, lounging unafraid, their long tails sweeping the stone. This was their beach, not his. Teddy feared the water, not rats, but without a gun, and with their numbers doubling, a chill crept up his spine. He walked slowly along the shore, but another cliff cut off the beach ahead, and to its right, under the moonlight, lay an island he hadn't seen 2 days ago, a bar of brown soap with a tenuous grip on the sea. Where had it come from? The rats chittered, their claws clicking over the rocks, the sand disappearing beneath them. Teddy looked up the cliff and saw something impossible, an orange pulse halfway up the black face, flickering like flame. A cave, and someone was inside. Chuck, he was sure of it. Maybe he'd chased the paper down and gotten hurt, working his way across instead of down. Teddy swung his ranger cap at the nearest boulder, scattering the rats, and bounded up the rocks, kicking at the ones that followed until the last black eggs were clear. He climbed the cliff face, bleeding hands finding purchase, and found this ascent easier, steeper, but with more outcroppings, more forgiving grades. He climbed for an hour and a half under the stars, and as he climbed, Dolores slipped away from him. He couldn't picture her face, her hands, her 2 wide lips. She was gone, as she'd never been since her death, and he knew it was the exhaustion and hunger, but still, she was gone. Yet he could hear her, a voice in his skull urging him on, telling him he could live again. Was this the moment then? After 2 years of walking underwater, of staring at his gun in the dark, of gritting his teeth against the need for her, could this be when he finally put her away? It felt unreal, like a dream, but she told him it should feel that way. Told him to let her go. He promised he'd try. The orange light grew closer, its heat faint but certain. He reached the ledge, pulling himself up, and followed the cave's curve to find a woman standing on the other side of a small fire, her hands behind her back. She asked who he was, and he gave his name. She asked what he did. He said he was a cop. She recognized him as the marshal, her graying hair catching the firelight. He asked her to show her hands, wary of what she might hold. She obliged a thin surgical scalpel, which she kept. He said he was fine with that, assuming her a patient. She arched an eyebrow at his observation, and he admitted he hadn't eaten and was slower than usual. She asked if he'd slept well since arriving on the island. He admitted he hadn't. She sat, and he joined her across the fire. He declared her the real Rachel Solando. She shrugged. He asked if she'd killed her children. She claimed she'd never had children, never been married. She'd been staff, not just a patient, a doctor, in fact, the first female psychiatrist at Ashecliffe, a genuine pioneer. He considered the possibility that she was simply delusional, and she seemed to read the thought in his face, asking if he thought she was crazy. He denied it, but she pressed, acknowledging how strange it must seem, a woman hiding in a cave. He offered that there might be a reason, and she smiled darkly, shaking her head, insisting she wasn't crazy. She explained the trap of that logic: once people labeled you insane, every protest became proof of your insanity, a no-win situation. She called it a death sentence, noting that no one left Ward C, and those who did had undergone barbaric brain surgery right through the eye. She'd fought against it, written letters, and they'd silenced her rather than let her leave. He asked if she really had been a doctor, and she confirmed it. Still a doctor, in fact. She'd started asking questions about large shipments of sodium amytal and opium-based hallucinogens, about experimental surgical procedures. When he pressed her on what was happening there, she dismissed his mention of the Nuremberg Code. They'd obliterated it, she said. Radical treatments? Radical, yes, but not treatment. There was no treatment going on. She explained the funding came from slush funds and UAC, then turned the conversation to paying. She argued that paying wasn't about the flesh. The brain controlled everything, including pain, fear, sleep, empathy, hunger. She asked, what if you could control the brain? Recreate a man who needed no sleep, felt no pain or love, couldn't be interrogated because his memory was wiped clean. They were creating ghosts, she said, for ghostly work. He pointed out that kind of knowledge was years off, and she agreed, but insisted the groundwork was being laid now: brainwashing, deprivation experiments like the Nazis on Jews and the Soviets on prisoners. She struck the dirt floor, saying that a half-century from now people would say it began here, on Shutter Island, testing patients. He had no response. She warned him they wouldn't let him leave. He countered that he was a federal marshal. She laughed grimly, recounting her own story as a respected psychiatrist from a good family. It hadn't been enough. She asked about his past traumas, and he deflected, saying everyone had them. She pressed on particulars, asking if he had psychological weaknesses they could exploit, events that would make his committal seem inevitable, so that colleagues would say he'd finally cracked. He countered that could be said about anyone. She agreed, but insisted they'd say it about him. She asked about his head dreams, headaches. He admitted to migraines, which seemed to trouble her. Had he taken pills? Yes. Feeling off foggy? He nodded. She asked if he'd eaten their food, drunk their coffee, and then if he'd smoked their cigarettes. He admitted he'd been smoking his partner's. Had he ever taken one from a doctor or orderly? He remembered the sweet-tasting cigarette from Collie on their first day, and she could see the answer on his face. She explained. Neuroleptic narcotics took 3 to 4 days to reach workable levels, with effects barely noticeable: seizures, sometimes mistaken for migraines, but mostly just vivid, prolonged dreams, a foggy mind, sluggish thoughts. He told her to stop calling him a patient, and she clarified she was speaking rhetorically. He asked how much damage was already done if he avoided all food, cigarettes, coffee, pills from now on. She said a lot, pulling her hair back. He pressed for signs the drugs had taken effect: dry mouth coupled with drool impulse, tremors starting where the wrist meets the thumb, spreading, sensitivity to light, left brain headaches, words beginning to stick, a stutter. The woman's revelation hung in the fire-lit air. Everyone on the island knew what happened in that lighthouse. When Teddy asked directly what went on there, she answered simply, surgery. He pressed, noting they had surgical facilities in the hospital. She clarified it was brain surgery, then further exploratory surgery, not the kind that fixed anything, but the kind that opened the skull just to see what happened when they pulled on things. Illegal surgery, she said, learned from the Nazis. That was where they built their ghosts. He asked, who knew about it on the island? Everyone, she said. He didn't believe her, asking about orderlies and nurses. She held his gaze through the flames, her eyes steady and clear, and repeated it. Everyone. He didn't remember drifting off, but he must have, because she was shaking him awake, urgency in her voice. She told him he had to leave. They thought she was dead, thought she'd drowned, and if they came looking for him they might find her. He rubbed his eyes, groggy. She gave him directions, a road east of the cliff top that wound west, leading behind the old commander's mansion in about an hour. He asked if she was the real Rachel Solando, knowing the one he'd met earlier was a fake. She asked how he knew. He remembered the shoe polish on his thumbs the night before, and then touching her face. Her hair had been recently dyed. She turned him toward the opening, insisting he go. He offered to come back for her, to take her off the island. She smiled sadly, brushing his hair, and told him he hadn't listened. He'd never get off the island. She said he was one of them now. He paused at the ledge and asked about his friend, the one who'd been with him, if she'd seen him. Her smile was just as sad as she told him he had no friends. By the time he made it to the back of Collie's house, his legs could barely carry him. He came around to the road and started toward the gate, the distance feeling 4 times what it had been that morning. A man emerged from the dark beside him, sliding an arm under Teddy's, remarking that they'd been wondering when he'd show up. It was the warden. His skin was waxy white and smooth, almost translucent. His nails were long and white, meticulously filed. But his eyes were what unsettled Teddy most. A silken blue, filled with a strange, infantile wonder. Teddy greeted him, and the warden returned the pleasantry, asking if he'd been taking a stroll. Teddy claimed he'd been touring the island now that the patient was found. The warden asked if he'd come across their natives, and it took Teddy a moment to realize he meant the rats. Teddy dismissed them as just rats, but the warden found something almost regal in them. Or at least, he said, watching how they moved. At the gate, the warden turned them to face Collie's house and the sea, asking if Teddy had enjoyed God's latest gift. Teddy didn't follow, and the warden swept his arm across the torn grounds, calling it God's violence, a divine hand reaching down. He insisted God loved violence, and when Teddy disagreed, the warden argued that violence was what humans did most naturally, that they waged war and burned sacrifices to show God they'd learn from his example. He stepped closer, asking if his violence could conquer Teddy's. Teddy denied being violent. The warden spit at his feet, calling him as violent as they come, claiming they were the same breed. He leaned in, asking if Teddy could stop him from sinking his teeth into his eye. Teddy invited him to try. The warden whispered encouragement, then quoted Byron about chains and friendship. Teddy asked what he meant, and the warden assured him he'd remember that line. Teddy smiled back, commenting that they'd broken the mold with him. The warden stepped back, noting that someone Collie thought Teddy's endgame was harmless. But the warden didn't. He crossed his hands behind his back, military style, and stared at Teddy, saying he knew him. Teddy pointed out they'd just met. The warden shook his head slowly, claiming their kind had known each other for centuries. He knew Teddy to his core. He found Teddy sad, which was pathetic in a man, but fine because it didn't affect him. But dangerous, he added. That was another matter. Teddy offered that every man had a right to his opinion, and the warden's face darkened. He launched into a tirade about the foolishness of men, their eating and drinking and fornicating, their procreation producing retards and mud children and lunatics and people of low moral character who spoiled the earth. He spoke of the South trying to keep their niggers in line, but declared everyone was a nigger down there, white, black women, no more useful than 2-legged dogs. He pointed at Teddy, calling him a nigger too, of low fiber, which he could smell. Teddy told him he wouldn't have to worry about him after the morning, that he'd be off the island. The warden stepped closer, his smile gone, and told him he wasn't going anywhere. Teddy disagreed, and the warden leaned in, sniffing the air beside Teddy's face, then the other side. Teddy asked if he smelled something, and the warden said it smelled like fear. Teddy suggested he take a shower to wash it off himself. They stood in silence, and then the warden told him to remember those chains. They were his friends, and that he was looking forward to their final dance, whatever carnage they'd achieve. He turned and walked away toward his house. The men's dormitory was empty. Teddy went to his room, hung his slicker, found no sign. Chuck had returned. He resisted sitting on the bed, knowing he'd pass out, and went to the bathroom to splash cold water on his face and comb his crew cut. His bones felt scraped, his blood thick, his eyes sunken and red-ringed, his skin gray. He dried off and went outside. The compound was deserted, the air warming into humidity, crickets and cicadas tuning up. He walked the grounds hoping to find Chuck, but there was only the guard at the gate and lights in the rooms. He tried the hospital door locked. He heard the gate squeak as the guard joined his comrade outside, and Teddy was alone again, locked in but unwatched. He sat on the steps briefly, then walked around back and spotted an orderly, a slim black kid smoking on the landing. Teddy approached, asked for a light, and accepted one, careful not to inhale, remembering the woman's warning. He asked how the kid was doing, where everyone was. The kid said there was some big meeting inside, with doctors, nurses, patients, most orderlies. He'd been stuck guarding the door because the latch was broken. Through the window, Teddy saw the hallway filling, people heading for the front door. He thanked the kid and walked around front to find a crowd milling, talking, lighting cigarettes. He spotted Nurse Marino and Trey Washington laughing together and started toward them when Collie called his name from the stairs. Collie came down, touched his elbow, and walked him toward the wall, asking where he'd been. Teddy said he'd been wandering, looking at the island. Collie asked if he'd found anything amusing, and Teddy said rats. Collie acknowledged they had plenty. Teddy asked about the roof repairs, and Collie sighed, describing buckets catching water, the wrecked attic, the guest bedroom floor, his wife's wedding gown ruined. Teddy asked where his wife was. Collie said Boston, where they kept an apartment. She and the kids had taken a week's vacation, needing a break from the place. Teddy said he'd only been 3 days, and it got to him. Collie nodded softly, then said he'd be going home soon, now that Rachel was found. The ferry would be there at 11, have him back in Boston by noon. Teddy responded with dry enthusiasm. Collie, meaning no offense, said Teddy's presence had agitated some patients. Johnny Law in town made them tense. Teddy apologized, and Collie said it wasn't his fault, just what he represented. Then he mentioned a rumor that an unidentified man in orderly's clothes had been on the main floor of Ward C that afternoon, a stranger with experience subduing dangerous men, and, allegedly, that man had a long conversation with a known paranoid schizophrenic named George Noyce. Teddy played along, asking what kind of tales Noyce spun. Collie said the usual paranoid delusions, the world against him, and that he'd been beaten up by another patient 2 weeks ago. Teddy asked what kind of yarns, what kind of tales, pressing for more. Collie dismissed Noyce's claims as the usual paranoid delusions, then turned the conversation to Teddy's departure, asking if he'd be taking the first ferry. Teddy agreed, with a frosty smile, as long as someone woke them up. Collie said they could handle that. When Collie offered a cigarette, Teddy declined, saying he was cutting down. Collie mentioned that journals linked tobacco to cancer and other terrible things. Teddy observed that there were so many ways to die these days, and Collie agreed, adding that there were more and more ways to cure. He wouldn't be in his profession otherwise. Teddy asked if they'd ever had a patient named Andrew Lettuce. Collie said the name didn't ring a bell. Teddy said he was a guy he'd known in the war, heard he'd gone crazy and been sent here. Collie said he'd heard wrong. Then Collie caught Teddy's use of the word us and asked about it. Teddy clarified he meant himself, but then asked if Collie had seen his partner. Collie was confused, asking who. Teddy said Chuck, his partner. Collie's expression shifted. He told Teddy he didn't have a partner, that he'd come alone. Teddy froze, processing the words. Collie stepped closer, his gaze cold and probing, like a straight man waiting for the punchline. Teddy realized he was ollie to Collie's stand, the last one in on the joke. If he protested, demanded answers, argued about Chuck, he'd be playing into their hands. Instead, he met Collie's eyes and saw the laughter there. He spoke the logic of the insane man's syllogism. Insane men deny they're insane. Bob denies he's insane. Ergo, Bob is insane. Collie leaned back smiling, and Teddy returned the smile. They stood in silence. For a moment, the night breeze stirring the trees. Colley spoke of building something valuable, misunderstood in its own time, with powerful enemies who would wrest it from his control. He wouldn't allow that without a fight. Teddy said he understood. Colley asked about his partner, and Teddy asked, "What partner?" Back in the room, Trey Washington lay on his bunk reading. Chuck's bed was remade. No trace anyone had slept there. Teddy changed into his own clothes, transferred Lettuce's intake form and his notebook to his coat pocket, and sat across from Trey, tying his tie and shoes. Trey wouldn't meet his eyes, turning pages of the same magazine over and over. He mentioned it would be hot tomorrow, the patients didn't like the heat, and there was a full moon coming, which would make things worse. Teddy asked if he believed the full moon made people crazy. Trey said he knew it did. The moon affected the tide, had a magnetic effect on water, and the human brain was over 50% water. Teddy asked how long Trey had been there. Since 1946, after the army, where they'd given him a pot instead of a gun. He'd fought the Germans with bad cooking. Teddy agreed it was bullshit, and Trey said if they'd let black soldiers into the war, it would have been over by 44. Teddy said he'd seen the world, different languages, same shit. Then Teddy told Trey that the warden had called him a nigger that night. Trey looked up from his magazine, disbelief in his face. Teddy confirmed the warden's words that he'd been called a nigger, part of the low-fiber masses that spoil the earth. Trey chuckled darkly, then stopped, telling Teddy he didn't know what it was to truly be one. Teddy acknowledged that, but pointed out the warden was still his boss. Trey insisted he wasn't. He worked for the hospital side, not the prison side. Teddy pressed, saying in a pinch Trey would still hop to him. Trey looked ready to hit him, and Teddy doubled down, saying he'd noticed people on the island created their own truth, that Trey would deny ever knowing Chuck, deny playing poker with him, laughing with him, hearing his advice about Trey's mean aunt. Trey finally said he didn't know what Teddy was talking about. Teddy pushed, saying the truth had been decided. He never had a partner, and Chuck wasn't out there hurt or dead or locked up. He made Trey repeat it. You never had a partner. Then Teddy added, and you don't work for the warden. Trey's hands clasped his knees, his eyes moist, his chin trembling. He whispered that Teddy needed to get out, that he had no idea what was really happening, that they would get to him, and there was no coming back. Teddy pressed him for answers, but Trey shook his head, saying he couldn't court, that Teddy was on his own and he wouldn't wait for the ferry. Teddy laughed, saying he was locked in, and Trey pointed out the southwest corner of the wall where the electrical wires were dead from the storm. He warned Teddy not to touch any other section, they'd fry him. Teddy asked about Chuck, and Trey scowled, saying there was no Chuck, never was, and Teddy should forget him. At the wall, Teddy tested the wires with a long twig. The live ones sparked and flamed. The dead section gave nothing. He climbed, his shoulders, knees, and forearms brushing the wire, expecting death each time, but nothing happened. He dropped to the other side, relieved and scared, and looked back at Ashecliffe. He'd come for truth and lettuce, and found neither, and along the way he'd lost Chuck. He promised himself he'd return with subpoenas, federal warrants, righteous fury. But for now, he was just relieved to be alive. It took him an hour and a half to get back to the cave, but the woman was gone. The fire had burned to embers. He sat by it, waiting, hoping she'd gone for wood or that Chuck had found her and they'd gone somewhere safer. But he knew she wasn't coming back. The fire died, and he draped his jacket over himself, leaning his head against the wall. Just before sleep took him, he noticed his thumbs had begun to twitch. Teddy surfaced from a nightmare into the gray light of dawn, the lingering images of the dream clinging to him like cobwebs. In that strange kitchen of the mind, he had watched a parade of the dead, and the possibly dead donning their coats. His father, Chuck, his mother, the ghost of Tutti Vicelli, all of them dripping wet, their garments leaving puddles on the floor. The scene had twisted into something grotesque and strangely peaceful. Lettuce, a Rachel Solando naked, had appeared, and he had found himself in an absurd tableau with his wife, the warden and his men watching it all unfold, the dream logic making it feel perversely perfect. Then the warden had addressed his men, warning them about a well-hung white nigger who could not be allowed off the island. The phrase had jolted him awake, and he found himself in the cave, throwing his coat off his chest and scrambling to its edge. The warden's voice, real this time, carried down from the ridge above him. He was briefing his search party, laying out Teddy's military record with unsettling precision: the Purple Heart, the oak leaf clusters, the 2 men he'd killed in Sicily with his bare hands, his expertise in hand-to-hand combat. Teddy listened, a grim smile touching his lips despite the danger. The man's command to his men was to avoid getting close and to put him down like a 2-legged dog if they got the chance. Teddy wondered, with a flicker of dark amusement, how many times his men had heard that particular phrase. 3 guards rappelled down the smaller cliff face, and Teddy pulled back from the ledge, watching as they scoured the beach below. When they reported back that he wasn't there, Teddy waited, listening, timing, letting the search party move on. He gave them a full hour before he crept out of the cave and made his way up to the road, his throat dry as salt, his eyes burning from sweat and fatigue. The heat was oppressive, just as Trey had predicted, and as he walked, the image of Chuck from his dream putting on that pre-war cashmere coat, following the dead out the door, stabbed at him with a pain that eclipsed even the hallucination of lettuce with Dolores. The symbolism was clear and brutal. They had gotten to Chuck, probably while Teddy was still scrambling up from the field below the promontory, and whoever had taken him had been so efficient that there hadn't even been a scream. The logistics of the conspiracy chilled him. To make 2 federal marshals vanish on the same island required power beyond imagination. For Teddy, the plan seemed to be madness, a convenient, institutional insanity. But Chuck's fate, he reasoned, must have been different. No one would believe 2 marshals had cracked simultaneously. Chuck's end would likely be presented as an accident, perhaps a casualty of the hurricane. If Teddy didn't escape, the field office would send others, and what would they find? He looked down at his hands, at the tremors that had returned, and felt his mind clouding. By the time they arrived, he'd likely be a drooling wreck, and the asylum's narrative would be sealed. A ferry horn cut through his thoughts, and he saw the boat making its turn in the harbor. He pushed his pace, coming up on the back of Colley's house. He could hear the activity at the dock boxes thumping, dollies clanking, the murmur of men, but as he reached the tree line, he saw the guards positioned with their rifles, scanning the woods and the grounds with an intense focus. Their purpose was clear. They were there to make sure he never got on that boat. He crept back, circled around, and found himself at Colley's beloved maroon Buick Roadmaster, waxed and gleaming even after the hurricane. He opened the door, smelled the rich leather, and rifled the glove compartment for matches. An idea took shape. He knotted his tie around a stone, unscrewed the gas cap, and fed the improvised fuse into the tank, leaving only the floral fabric draping out. He remembered Dolores giving him that tie, remembered the love with which she draped it over his eyes, and whispered an apology for using it this way. Then he lit the match, lit the book, and set the fabric ablaze. He ran. Halfway through the woods the car exploded, a roar of heat and light and the tinkle of shattering windows. He burst from the trees near the shore, balling up his suit coat and hiding it under rocks. Guards and ferrymen were running toward the fire, and he knew his window of opportunity was a matter of seconds. He sprinted for the water, no time for second thoughts, and plunged in. The cold hit him like a violent shock, punching the breath from his lungs, but he kept moving, diving under the surface to avoid the shouts coming from Colley's house. The water was alive with imagined threats: eels, crabs, sharks, but he forced himself to swim, to ignore the sledgehammer beat of his heart. He could almost see the dead girl from his dreams floating just below him, her eyes open and resigned, but he shook the image away, and then he saw the black stripe of the ferry's keel ahead of him. He grabbed the keel, pulled himself along the hull, and surfaced slowly, just his head above the water. He found the ladder. As he hung there, he heard the men running back to the dock, heard the warden's sharp command to search the boat, his rebuke of a guard who dared to argue. The ladder dipped with the weight of the searchers, and in the water, something brushed his thigh. He gritted his teeth, forced his mind blank, and tried not to imagine what it was. Above him, Colley's voice, ragged with fury, rose in complaint about his car. The warden pressed him, warning that if Teddy got off the island, they'd all be destroyed. Collie shouted back, insisting he wouldn't even as Teddy clung to the ladder, a desperate fugitive inches from freedom or capture. The two men fell silent on the dock above him, their weight shifting on the planks as the standoff stretched. Teddy hung in the water, the cold gnawing at his feet, a deep, burning numbness spreading up his legs. When the warden finally spoke, his voice was flat and final. The ferry was not to leave the dock until Teddy was found. Collie's protest that someone would need to answer for that in Boston was met with cold dismissal. The ferry stayed. Something nudged Teddy's leg again, a slick, probing touch that made his skin crawl, but he forced himself still. Collie gave in, and then something else brushed against his calf. He kicked back instinctively, the splash slicing through the air like a gunshot, and footsteps pounded the stern above him. A guard called out that Teddy wasn't on board. The warden's question hung in the air. Where had he gone? Collie's sharp curse cut through the confusion, and he declared that Teddy was heading for the lighthouse. The warden wasn't surprised. He'd considered that possibility himself. Collie insisted he would handle it alone, even as the warden told him to take men. The argument was brief and sharp, ending with Collie's footsteps banging up the dock and fading into the sand. The warden's final order to his men was clear. The boat was going nowhere until the keys were in his hands. Teddy swam for shore, dropping away from the ferry and pulling himself through the water, clawing at the sandy bottom when it came within reach. He surfaced after a few hundred yards, just long enough to see the guards forming a ring around the dock before plunging back under. He kept to the shallows, avoiding any splashing, and followed the bend in the shoreline until he could finally walk onto the sand. The sun was warm on his shivering body, but the cold had seeped deep into his bones. He followed the shore as far as he could, tying his shoes around his neck when the outcroppings forced him back into the water. The swim was long and brutal, his mind conjuring images of his father's bones on the ocean floor, of sharks and barracuda with teeth like razors. But he pushed through it, driven by necessity. He knew he might have to do this again for the Betsy Ross, and he knew the only way to beat his fear was to face it, though the thought of ever entering the sea again filled him with a deep, primal dread. He spotted the lighthouse around 1 o'clock, gauging the time by the sun. He came ashore below the bluff and lay against a rock, letting the warmth seep into his blue-tinged skin until the shakes began to subside. The thought of Chuck was a constant knot in his chest. If Chuck was in that lighthouse alive or dead, Teddy was going to bring him out. He wouldn't leave him behind. But a voice, Dolores's voice, whispered that he would die for that choice. He knew she was right. If he had to wait 2 days for the fishing trawler, moving through the island with someone who wasn't fully functional, they'd be hunted down like two-legged dogs. He told her he couldn't leave his partner. She reminded him he'd only just met him. He insisted it didn't matter if Chuck was in there, suffering. He had to try, even if it meant dying. Then Dolores's voice, soft and resigned, said she hoped Chuck wasn't in there. He pushed himself off the rock and followed a path along the shore, the thought surfacing that Collie had misread his despair. It wasn't suicide he craved. It was something more passive, a death wish, a refusal to find a reason to live, but equally a refusal to take his own life, which in his darkest hours had always seemed pathetic and puny. But to... A guard materialized in front of him, caught as off guard as Teddy himself, his fly gaping and his rifle slung behind his back. Teddy didn't hesitate. He drove the heel of his hand into the man's throat, dropped low, and swept his leg, sending the guard toppling. A hard kick to the temple silenced him, and Teddy pulled the rifle from under the unconscious man's body. He hadn't killed him, but now he had a weapon. He used the rifle to disarm the next guard, a kid, barely more than a boy, knocking him out with a swift strike to the head. Inside the fence perimeter, Teddy found a small bunkhouse with cots, girly magazines, stale coffee, and a couple of guard uniforms. He left them, crossing to the lighthouse and pushing the door open with the rifle. The first floor was a dank, empty cement room, nothing but mold and a spiral staircase. The second floor was the same. There had to be a basement, something larger, perhaps connected to the hospital complex by underground corridors, because so far this structure was just a lighthouse. A scraping sound came from above. He climbed another flight to a heavy iron door and pressed the rifle barrel against it. It gave slightly. He heard the scrape again, smelled cigarette smoke, felt the ocean breeze on his face. If the warden had posted guards behind that door, Teddy knew he was walking into a death trap. But he had to go through. Dolores's voice told him to run. He refused. She asked why, and he said it all came to this everything. His whole life, lettuce, Chuck, Noyce, all of it. It either stopped, or he did. Then she spoke about Chuck's hands, saying they didn't fit him. Teddy knew she was pointing at something important, but he pushed the thought aside. He told her he was going through the door. She told him to be careful. He crouched to the left of the door, rifle butt braced against his ribs, and kicked it open, dropping to his knee and sighting down the barrel. Collie sat behind a table, back to a small window, the ocean spreading blue and silver behind him. He didn't look startled or afraid. He tapped his cigarette against an ashtray and greeted Teddy with a question that echoed from Teddy's own nightmares. "Why you all wet, baby?" The room was small and strange, the walls obscured by pink bed sheets held in place with wrinkled tape. On the table before Collie lay a collection of items that made Teddy's stomach turn folders: a field radio, his own notebook, the intake form for lettuce, and his suit jacket. In the corner, a reel-to-reel tape recorder whirred softly, its microphone aimed at the room. Collie scribbled in a leather-bound notebook, then gestured for Teddy to sit. Teddy ignored the invitation, demanding to know what Collie had said before the question that had hit him like a physical blow. Collie refused to repeat it, and Teddy stepped into the room, rifle still trained on him. Collie kept writing, then informed Teddy that the rifle was empty. Teddy checked the breech and confirmed it, firing a dry click at the wall for good measure. Collie told him to put it in the corner, and Teddy complied, laying it on the floor. He pulled out a chair but remained standing, his eyes fixed on the sheets. Collie deflected the question, tossing him a towel to dry off. Teddy stripped off his wet shirt, dried himself, and put on his jacket, then finally sat. Collie asked about the guards he'd injured. Teddy said they'd live. Collie cranked the field radio and spoke into it, instructing someone to send Dr. Sheehan to check on the men before sending him up. The name hung in the air. Teddy remarked on the elusive Dr. Sheehan, and Collie confirmed he'd been on the island the whole time, hiding in plain sight. This had been their plan, Collie's and Sheehan's. Teddy asked how it was working out. Collie admitted it wasn't going well. Looking across the table, Teddy saw something in the man's face that didn't fit something he'd glimpsed before in the stairwell and the staff meeting. Compassion. If he didn't know better, he'd swear that's what it was. He forced himself to look away, scanning the room. So this was it. The lighthouse. The great truth he'd been seeking. Collie agreed, asking if it was everything he'd hoped for. Teddy countered that he hadn't seen the basement. Collie informed him there was no basement. It was a lighthouse. Teddy's notebook sat on the table, and Collie confirmed it contained his case notes, found with his jacket near the house after Teddy had blown up Collie's car. Teddy offered a flat apology. Collie mourned the vehicle, recalling the satisfaction of checking off that box in the showroom back in '47. Teddy shrugged again. Collie pressed him, wondering if Teddy had truly believed he could reach the ferry, even with the whole island as a diversion. Teddy admitted it was the only way off. He had to try. Collie muttered his grief over the car, then asked if Teddy wanted water. He poured 2 glasses, and Teddy drained his in one swallow. Collie observed the dry mouth, the tremors, and asked about his headache. As if on cue, a hot wire of pain ignited behind Teddy's left eye, spreading through his temple and jaw. He lied, saying it wasn't bad. Collie predicted it would get worse. Teddy drank more water, then mentioned the woman doctor who had warned him about the neuroleptics, the 4-day buildup, the dry mouth, the headaches, the shakes. Collie smiled, and said it wasn't from neuroleptics, it was from withdrawal. Teddy demanded to know what he was withdrawing from. Collie flipped open the notebook to the final code, and asked if Teddy had broken it. Teddy admitted he hadn't had the chance. Collie pushed him to try, but Teddy's head was pounding too hard. He pressed the question again. Withdrawal from what? Colley leaned back, yawning, and named the drug chlorpromazine with its many downsides. He'd hoped to start Teddy on something else, but that wasn't going to happen now. Teddy repeated the name, and Colley confirmed it, adding that he'd been medicating Teddy for the past 2 years. Teddy laughed it off, imagining a conspiracy of coffee-spiking newsstand operators. Colley corrected him. Not in Boston. Here. Teddy had been a patient at this institution for 2 years. The tide crashed against the bluff below, and Teddy clasped his shaking hands together, insisting he was a U.S. Marshal. Colley said he was one. Teddy countered, giving the date of his departure from Boston. Colley drilled him on the details: how he got to the ferry, where he parked, what he did on Sunday, and Teddy's mind went blank, the wire in his head digging deeper. He remembered Buttonwood, but it had burned. He fumbled for the name Castlemont, but the details were slipping. Colley pushed Lettuce's intake form across the table, asking if he'd looked at it. Teddy admitted he hadn't. Colley whistled, pointing out that this document, proof of a 67th patient, could have blown the lid off the entire place if Teddy had gotten it to Senator Hurley. Teddy agreed. Yes, that document could have been the key. Colley pressed him on why he hadn't looked at it in the last 24 hours. Teddy started to plead the chaos of recent events, but Colley cut him off and ordered him to read it now. Teddy's eyes skimmed the intake form, the name, age, and date for Lettuce, and landed on the comments section, which described the patient as highly intelligent, highly delusional, violent, and deeply in denial about his crime, having constructed elaborate fantasies to avoid confronting the truth. The signature at the bottom belonged to Dr. Lehane. Teddy remarked that it sounded accurate. Colley pressed him. Accurate regarding whom? Teddy said. Lettuce. Colley stood and pulled down one of the pink bed sheets, revealing 4 names written in enormous block letters: Edward Daniels, Andrew Lettuce, Rachel Solando, and Dolores Channel. Teddy waited, sensing Colley was setting up a point. Eventually, he prompted him. Colley directed his attention to the names, pointing out that Teddy's name, patient 67's name, the missing patient's name, and Teddy's wife's name were all there. He called it the Rule of 4. Teddy rubbed his temple, trying to ease the throbbing pain, and asked him to explain. Colley turned the question back on him, asking what the names Edward Daniels and Andrew Lettuce had in common. Teddy saw only that they both had 13 letters. Colley pushed him to look deeper. Teddy stared, his vision blurring, the letters softening at the edges. He could find nothing else. Colley grew impatient, slapping the wall with the back of his hand. Teddy shook his head, nauseated, the letters jumping before his eyes. Colley shouted the answer. They were the same letters. The names were anagrams. Teddy denied it, but Colley insisted, pointing out that the exact same 13 letters formed both names. He reminded Teddy of his gift for codes, his near miss of becoming a code breaker in the war. Teddy pressed his hands against his eyes, trying to block out the truth, but Colley pushed him to look again. The letters quivered, but the revelation was undeniable. Colley moved to the next line. Dolores Channel and Rachel Solando, also 13 letters, also anagrams. Teddy refused to accept it, but Colley was relentless. This was the truth Teddy had come for. The 67th patient wasn't some shadowy figure, it was him. His name was Andrew Lettuce. Teddy screamed his denial. Colley repeated it, stating he'd been committed by court order 22 months ago. Teddy threw his hand up, dismissing the claim as beneath even them. Colley urged him to look at the evidence, to consider the terrible crime he'd committed. One society couldn't forgive, but Colley could. Teddy refused to be called Andrew, insisting his name was Edward Daniels. Colley shook his head in weary defeat, explaining that Teddy had created a dense, heroic fantasy to escape his guilt, and that the conspiracy narrative was just a way to reject anything that contradicted it. He would have let Teddy live in that world if he were harmless, but he wasn't. He was the most violent patient they had, and if they couldn't bring him back to sanity now, permanent measures would be taken to ensure he never hurt anyone again. For a fraction of a second, Teddy almost believed him. Then he smiled, dismissing the whole thing as an act. He asked if Sheehan was the bad cop due to make an entrance. Cawley told him to look into his eyes. Teddy did, seeing the redness from lack of sleep. Something else, too, a deep, genuine sorrow. If he didn't know better, he'd swear the man was heartbroken. Cawley pleaded with him, saying he was all Teddy had, all he'd ever had. He'd been hearing this fantasy for 2 years, knew every detail, the codes, the missing partner, the storm, the woman in the cave, the lighthouse experiments, Noyce, the fictional Senator Hurley, the dreams of Dolores with her leaking belly and waterlogged body, the logs. Teddy called him a liar, his voice sharp with defiance. Cawley asked how he could possibly know the details he just recited, and Teddy began counting off the evidence on his trembling fingers: the food, the coffee, the cigarettes, the aspirin that had started it all, the drugs Cawley had given him after his migraine, the way he hadn't been the same since. He demanded to know what Cawley had given him. Cawley leaned back, grimacing as if swallowing something bitter, and whispered that he was running out of time. 4 days, almost gone. Teddy offered a sarcastic solution. Let him go, let him file a complaint, and with Cawley's powerful friends, it wouldn't amount to much anyway. Cawley shook his head, confessing that he was almost out of friends, that the scales had tipped against him after 8 years of fighting. He'd stake everything on an extravagant role-playing experiment to save Teddy, and if it failed, he would lose his position, his funding, everything. Teddy's response was flat and dismissive. That was too bad. Cawley tried another approach, asking if Teddy thought it was coincidence that Rachel Solando, a figment of his own imagination, shared the same letters as his dead wife and the same history of killing her children. Teddy stood, his arms shaking violently, and insisted his wife hadn't killed her kids, that they'd never had children. Cawley pulled down another sheet, revealing a crime scene diagram, photographs of a lake, and pictures of 3 dead children, their names written in block letters: Edward, Daniel, and Rachel Lettuce. Teddy stared at his trembling hands, wishing he could stop them. Cawley pressed him, asking if he would deny his children ever lived. Teddy pointed a jerking finger at the wall, insisting those were Rachel Solando's children, her lake house. Cawley corrected him. That was his house, the place they'd moved after Dolores had accidentally set their previous apartment on fire, hoping a bucolic setting would help her get better. Teddy refused to accept that Dolores had been ill. Cawley laid it out: her clinical depression, her manic depressive diagnosis, her suicide attempts, the warnings that she was a danger to herself and the children. Teddy shouted over him, insisting they never saw psychiatrists, that they never had children. His head pounded as if glass were being beaten into it. Cawley urged him to come closer, to look at the names on the photos, but Teddy dismissed them as fabrications. Cawley brought up the dreams, the 2 boys and the little girl who appeared in them, the headstone that called Teddy a bad sailor, the logs that haunted his sleep. He said it meant Teddy was a bad father, that he hadn't navigated for his children, hadn't saved them. Teddy screamed that it was bullshit. Cawley dared him to look, to tell him the children in the photos weren't the same ones from his dreams. Teddy refused, shifting his attack to the asylum's experiments, the lobotomies, the disregard for the Nuremberg Code. Cawley leaned against the wall, arms folded, and challenged him to produce evidence. Where were the Nazi doctors, the satanic operating rooms? He consulted his notes, amusedly recounting Teddy's earlier claims about brainwashing and ghost soldiers, and dismissed them as paranoid fantasies. Teddy pointed a shaking finger at him, listing the hospital's radical approaches, its policy of taking only the most violent patients. Cawley agreed with him. Teddy accused them of experimenting. Cawley clapped his hands and bowed, admitting as much but not surgically. He clarified. Surgery was a last resort used over his protests. Teddy called him a liar. Cawley sighed, and asked for one piece of evidence to support Teddy's theory. Teddy had none. Cawley pointed out that Teddy had refused to respond to all the evidence he'd presented. Teddy dismissed it all as fabricated. Then he demanded to be let off the island, invoking his authority as a federal officer. Cawley closed his eyes, and when he opened them they were harder. He pulled a leather briefcase from the floor, undid the buckles, and tossed Teddy's gun onto the table. He asked if it was his. The initials ED on the handle, the dent in the barrel from the Philip Stacks incident, the scraped trigger guard from a foot chase in St. Louis. Teddy confirmed it was his. Collie told him to pick it up, to check if it was loaded. Teddy lifted the gun, his hand shaking, and confirmed it was loaded. Collie pressed him to be certain, and Teddy confirmed he could feel the weight of the loaded weapon. Collie nodded grimly, telling him to fire if he wanted, because that was the only way off the island. Teddy tried to steady his shaking arm with his other hand, taking slow breaths, but the tremors wouldn't stop. Through the sweat in his eyes, he sighted down the barrel at Collie, who seemed to drift and sway like a man on rough seas. Collie gave him a 5-second countdown, lifting the radio phone and cranking the handle, then spoke into it, telling the warden to send someone up. Teddy's vision cleared, his shakes subsiding to small vibrations, and as Collie replaced the phone, a flicker of doubt crossed the doctor's face, as if only now did he realize Teddy might actually pull the trigger. Collie held up a hand, saying it was okay, but Teddy shot him in the chest anyway. Then he raised the barrel a half-inch and shot him in the face, with water. Collie blinked, frowned, and wiped his face with a handkerchief. The door opened behind Teddy, and he spun, taking aim at the figure entering. Chuck raised his hands and joked about forgetting his raincoat. Teddy stared as Collie dried himself and sat back down, and Chuck came around the table to take a seat beside the doctor, wearing a lab coat. Teddy's voice cracked with disbelief. He'd thought Chuck was dead. Chuck confirmed he wasn't. Teddy stammered, struggling to form words, saying he'd been willing to die to bring him out. He dropped the gun, all strength draining from him. Chuck, or rather, Sheehan apologized, explaining that he and Collie had agonized over the deception for weeks, certain they had no alternative. Collie added that this was their last-ditch effort, a radical role-playing experiment to bring Teddy back. Through the blur of sweat, Teddy asked who Chuck really was. Chuck extended a hand and introduced himself as Dr. Lester Sheehan. Teddy left the hand hanging in the air, and Sheehan withdrew it. Teddy's voice was bitter, as he realized the irony he'd been searching for Sheehan while talking to him all along. Sheehan nodded, admitting he'd kept up the guise as Chuck, calling him boss, telling jokes, watching over him. Teddy accused him of calling that friendship, of making it all okay. Sheehan insisted they'd known each other for 2 years, that he'd been Teddy's primary psychiatrist. Teddy refused to accept that name, but Sheehan urged him to look, to recognize him. Teddy wiped his eyes, and for a moment, he saw Chuck with his awkwardness around firearms, his hands that weren't a cop's hands but a doctor's. He'd trusted him, told him about his wife, his father, climbed down a cliff looking for him, and now he faced his betrayer. Sheehan lit a cigarette, and Teddy was pleased to see that his hands shook too, though less than his own. Sheehan explained that his disappearance had been part of the fantasy, but the intake form proof of Lettuce's existence was supposed to have been found on the road, not lost down the cliff. He'd gone after it, knowing Teddy would, and had frozen under the lip, nearly reaching out when Teddy dropped down in front of him. Collie interjected, saying they'd almost called the whole thing off when they saw Teddy go down that cliff. Teddy suppressed a bitter giggle at the idea. Collie called it a pageant, a play that Teddy had written and they'd helped him stage, and the ending was always meant to be reaching this lighthouse. Teddy scoffed at the convenience. Collie laid it out. Teddy had been telling the story for 2 years, the missing patient, the surgical experiments, the brainwashing, the partner named Chuck Awley, a name that was itself a joke. He'd woven a conspiracy to avoid the truth, and they drugged him and committed him before he could get his story to a fictional Senator Hurley. Teddy asked if they'd faked everything. Collie said yes. Teddy laughed, a deep, booming laugh that echoed off the walls. He slapped the table, demanding to know how they'd faked a hurricane. Collie admitted you couldn't fake one. Teddy slapped the table again, but Collie countered you could predict one, especially on an island. Teddy shook his head, a dying grin still fixed on his face, even as the warmth drained from it, making him feel foolish and weak. He accused them of never giving up. Collie explained that a storm had been essential to his fantasy. They'd waited for one. Teddy dismissed it as lies, but Collie pressed him explain the anagrams, the children from his dreams, how he'd known to say, "Why you all wet, baby?" When Teddy walked through the door. Teddy countered that he'd simply been wet. Collie paused, then leaned forward, saying his gun had been filled with water, and pointed to the final code in the notebook: 9 letters, 3 lines, a piece of cake to break. Sheehan interrupted, his voice urgent, saying they were running out of time. He spoke of a war within psychiatry, a losing battle. Teddy asked who "we" was, and Collie explained it was those who believed in an honest reckoning of the self, not ice picks or dangerous drugs. Teddy repeated the phrase with hollow sarcasm. Sheehan insisted that if they failed, the balance of power would shift irrevocably toward the surgeons and the pharmacists, a barbarism disguised by a palatable veneer. It came down to Teddy. Teddy insisted. His name was Teddy Daniels, but he began to work out the code in his head, first lying. "You." Collie warned that Naring had an operating room reserved in his name if this failed. Teddy would go into surgery. Teddy asked for what? Collie hesitated, and Sheehan spoke the words: a transorbital lobotomy. Teddy blinked, finding the second word, R. He noted that it was just like Noyce, and asked if they were going to tell him Noyce wasn't there either. Collie confirmed Noyce was there, and much of Teddy's story was true, but he'd never gone to Boston, never met him in a jail. He'd been at Ashecliffe since August of '50, had been transferred to Ward A, but then Teddy had assaulted him. Teddy denied it, but Collie insisted, saying Noyce had called him lettuce. Teddy refused to accept it, arguing he'd seen Noyce yesterday. Collie quoted from a transcript of their conversation, showing that Noyce had indeed said Teddy had done this to him. Teddy argued the interpretation, insisting he meant something different. Collie moved on, quoting Noyce, saying that everything, the whole game, the stage play, was for Teddy. Teddy sat back, asking why none of the patients had spoken up during his 4-day masquerade. Collie explained they were used to it, that Teddy had been flashing a plastic badge for a year. Teddy asked to finish the code. Collie agreed, watching as he arranged the letters. The final message was clear: "You are him." Teddy turned the notebook around, and Collie looked exhausted, speaking with an air of desolation. He admitted they'd hoped to save Teddy, had staked their reputations on it, but now they'd be remembered for allowing a patient to play out his grandest illusion, resulting in injured guards and a burned car. He spoke of a future where human experience would be medicated out of existence, and Teddy gave him nothing in return. Collie listed Teddy's violent history at the hospital: 8 guards, 4 patients, 5 orderlies, and said he and Sheehan had fought for him as long as they could, but the clinical and penal staffs were demanding results. If Teddy didn't accept who he was and what he'd done, if he didn't make an effort to swim toward sanity, they couldn't save him. He held out his hand, his voice hoarse, begging Teddy to take it, to help him save him. Teddy shook it firmly, gave him a forthright gaze, and smiled. Then he told him to stop calling him Andrew. They bound him in shackles and led him to Ward C, taking him down into the basement where the cells lined the walls. The men inside shouted threats, promises of violence, of rape, of grotesque mutilation, their voices bouncing off the stone. Guards flanked him as a nurse entered his cell with a syringe. She had strawberry hair and smelled of soap, and as she leaned in, Teddy recognized her. He accused her of being the one who'd pretended to be Rachel. She told the guards to hold him, and they gripped his shoulders, straightening his arms. He persisted, saying she'd been the one with dye in her hair, the one who'd played the role so convincingly. She told him not to flinch, and sank the needle into his arm. He caught her eye, praising her performance, all that talk of her dear dead Jim. She dropped her gaze, told him her name was Emily, and pulled the needle out, telling him to sleep. He said please, and she paused at the door, looking back. He said it had been her. Her eyes gave a tiny downward flick, a nod, and she smiled with such sorrow that he wanted to kiss her hair. She said good night, and left. He never felt the guards remove his manacles or heard them leave. The sounds from the other cells faded, the air turned amber around his face, and he felt as if he were floating on a wet cloud, his hands and feet turning to sponge. Then he dreamed. In the dream, he and Dolores lived in a house by a lake. They'd left the city because the city was mean and violent, because she'd set their Buttonwood apartment on fire, trying to rid it of ghosts. He dreamed of their love as steel, impervious to fire, rain, or hammer blows. He dreamed that Dolores was insane. His daughter Rachel spoke to him one night. He'd been drinking but not so drunk that he couldn't read her a bedtime story. She said Mommy looked at her funny sometimes. He asked how. She said just funny. He asked if it made her laugh. She shook her head. He pressed, asking how Mommy looked at her, and she said it was like she made her really sad. He tucked her in, kissed her, nuzzled her neck, and told her she didn't make anyone sad, wouldn't, couldn't, ever. Another night, he came to bed and found Dolores rubbing the scars on her wrists. She told him that when he went to the other place, part of him didn't come back, and the part that did shouldn't. She thought the butcher on the corner was a spy who knew Russian, and she said she could sometimes feel his cleaver in her breasts. Little Teddy said once at Fenway Park that they could live there. Andrew asked what was wrong with where they lived. The boy said there was too much water. Andrew took a drink from his flask and considered his son tall and strong, but too quick to cry, too easily spooked. He wished his mother were alive to teach the grandkids that the world didn't give. It took. Dolores filled their heads with dreams and fantasies, too many movies and circuses. He took another drink and asked if there was anything else. The boy said no, sir. He would ask Dolores what was wrong, what he wasn't giving her, how he could make her happy. She insisted she was happy, that she was fine. He pushed back, saying she got angry, and when she wasn't angry she was too happy, bouncing off the walls. She asked which it was. He said it scared the kids, scared him. She insisted she was fine, and when he said she was sad all the time, she said that was him. He talked to the priest, who made a visit or two. He talked to her sisters, and the older one, Delilah, came up from Virginia for a week, which seemed to help. But they both avoided doctors. Doctors were for crazy people. Dolores wasn't crazy, she was just tense, and sad. He dreamed she woke him one night, telling him to get his gun. The butcher was in their house, she said, downstairs in the kitchen, talking on her phone in Russian. Then he was back on the sidewalk in front of the coconut grove, leaning into the taxi, his face an inch from hers. He'd looked in, and known her his whole life, had been waiting for her to appear. He'd known her in the womb. There was no desperation to have sex before shipping out, because he knew he was coming back. The gods didn't align the stars to show you the other half of your soul and then take her away. He told her this, said he was coming home. She touched his face and asked him to do that. He dreamed of coming home to the house by the lake after 2 weeks in Oklahoma, chasing a fugitive from the South Boston docks to Tulsa. He walked in at 11 in the morning, grateful the boys were in school, feeling the road in his bones and craving his own pillow. He called out to Dolores as he poured a double scotch. She came in from the backyard, her old dark dress soaked, water dripping from her hair. He asked why she was all wet. She said there wasn't enough, placed a bottle on the counter and said she was still awake. Then she walked back outside. He watched her sway toward the gazebo, her steps long and unsteady. He set down his drink and picked up the bottle laudanum, prescribed after her hospital stay. When he traveled, he portioned out her doses into a small bottle in the medicine cabinet and locked the main bottle in the cellar. There were 6 months of doses in this bottle, and she'd drunk it dry. He saw her stumble up the gazebo stairs, fall to her knees, and rise again. How had she gotten to it? The lock was unpickable, and he had the only key. She sat in the porch swing, and he remembered the night he'd left, doling out the teaspoons, taking a belt of rye, looking at the lake, putting the small bottle away, saying goodbye to the kids, answering the phone, grabbing his coat and bag, kissing her at the door and leaving the big bottle on the counter. He crossed the lawn to the gazebo and climbed the steps. She watched him, soaking wet, pushing the swing lazily. He asked when she'd drunk at all. She said that morning, her tongue poking out, a dreamy smile on her face, looking up at the ceiling. Not enough. She said she couldn't sleep. She was too tired. He saw the logs floating in the lake and knew they weren't logs, but he looked away, back at her. He asked why she was tired. She shrugged, flopping her hands, saying she was tired of all of it, just wanted to go home. He told her she was home. She pointed at the ceiling. "Home, home," she said. He looked at the logs again, turning in the water. He asked where Rachel was. She said school. He reminded her that Rachel was too young. "Not my school," she said, and showed her teeth. Teddy screamed. He screamed so loudly that Dolores fell from the swing, and he vaulted over her, over the railing, running and screaming, "No, God, please, not my babies," and plunged into the water. He stumbled, went under, and surfaced in the middle of them. The 3 logs. His babies. Edward and Daniel were face down, but Rachel was on her back, eyes open to the sky, her mother's desolation in her pupils. He carried them out one by one, carefully, firmly, gently, feeling their bones, caressing their cheeks, shoulders, ribs, legs, feet, kissing them again and again. He dropped to his knees and vomited until his chest burned. He crossed their arms over their chests, noticed rope burns on Daniel's and Rachel's wrists, knew Edward had been first, the others waiting, knowing she'd come back. He kissed them again, closed Rachel's eyes. Had they kicked, screamed, or gone soft and resigned? He saw Dolores in her violet dress the night he'd met her. The look on her face, he'd fallen in love with not insecurity, but terror, barely suppressed, always there. Terror of the outside world, of trains and bombs and angry men and sharks and Russians. But what terrified her most was inside her, an insect of unnatural intelligence living in her brain, her whole life, clicking across it, wrenching loose its cables. He left his children and sat on the gazebo floor watching her sway. The worst part was how much he loved her. He would sacrifice his mind, his limbs, anything she had carried him through the war, through this awful world. He loved her more than his life, more than his soul, but he'd failed her, failed his children, because he'd refused to see that her insanity wasn't her fault, not a moral weakness, because if she was his true love, what did that say about him? So he'd hidden from her, left her alone, let her mind consume itself. He wept, seeing her on the stoop with flowers, looking back at him on their honeymoon, pregnant, laughing, scared, and alone. He stood, knees shaking, and took a seat beside her. She called him her good man. He denied it. She took his hand, said she knew he loved her, that he wasn't perfect. He thought of Daniel and Rachel waking to their mother tying rope around their wrists, looking into her eyes. He begged her to stop talking. She climbed atop him, straddled him, hugging him, said they'd sit the children at the table, dry them off, change their clothes, let them sleep in their bed, take them on a picnic. He begged her to stop. She placed her hand on his gun. He clamped his hand over hers. She said she needed him to love her, to free her. He pulled her hand away, looked into her 2 bright eyes, not human, but a dog's, a wolf's. After Dachau, he'd sworn never to kill again unless he had no choice. He couldn't take one more death. She tugged at his gun, eyes brighter, and he removed her hand again. He looked at the shore, his children lined up. He pulled his gun, showed it to her. She bit her lip, weeping, nodded, looked at the roof. She said they'd pretend the children were with them, give them baths. He placed the gun against her belly, his hand and lips trembling, and told her he loved her. Even then, with the barrel pressed to her body, he was certain he couldn't do it. She looked down as if surprised she was still there, still beneath him, and told him she loved him too, so much, like he pulled the trigger. The sound of it came from her eyes, and air popped from her mouth. She placed her hand over the wound, looking at him, her other hand gripping his hair. As it spilled out of her, he pulled her to him, and she went soft against his body. He held her, and wept his terrible love into her faded dress. He sat up in the dark, the smell of cigarette smoke reaching him before he saw the coal. It flared as Sheehan took a drag watching him. He sat on the bed and wept, unable to stop, calling out Rachel's name. He saw her eyes watching the clouds, her hair floating around her. When the convulsions stopped and the tears dried, Sheehan asked which Rachel. "Rachel Lettuce," he said. "And who are you?" "Andrew," he said. "My name is Andrew Lettuce." Sheehan turned on a light, revealing Colley and a guard on the other side of the bars. Colley asked why he was there. He took the handkerchief Sheehan offered and wiped his face. Colley repeated the question. "He said because he murdered his wife." Colley asked why. "Because she murdered their children and needed peace." Sheehan asked if he was a U.S. Marshal. "No," he said. "Not anymore." How long had he been here? Since May 3, 1952. Who was Rachel Lettuce? His daughter, 4 years old. Who was Rachel Solando? She doesn't exist. He made her up. Colley asked why. He shook his head. Colley pressed. He said he didn't know, couldn't. Colley insisted he did. He grabbed his head, rocked in place, begging not to be made to say it. Colley gripped the bars, needing to hear it. He looked at Colley through the bars, wanting to lunge and bite his nose, but he forced the words out because he couldn't bear knowing he'd let his wife kill their babies. He'd ignored the signs, tried to wish it away, killed them, because he didn't get her help, and that knowledge was too much. He couldn't live with it. Colley said he had to. He pulled his knees to his chest. Sheehan looked at Colley, who lit a cigarette and watched steadily. Colley shared his fear they'd been here before 9 months ago, with the same breakthrough, and then Teddy had regressed rapidly. Andrew apologized. Colley appreciated it, but couldn't use an apology. He needed to know Andrew had accepted reality. None of them could afford another regression. Andrew looked at this thin, exhausted man who'd come to save him, who might be his only true friend. He saw his gun sound in her eyes, felt his son's wet wrists, saw his daughter's hair as he stroked it. He promised not to regress. His name was Andrew Lettuce. He murdered his wife Dolores in the spring of '52. The sun was in the room when he woke. He sat up, looking for bars, but found only a window lower than expected, until he realized he was on the top bunk in the room he'd shared with Trey and Bibby. It was empty. He dressed in his freshly laundered clothes, walked to the window, and tied his shoe, looking out at the compound. Patients, orderlies, and guards moved about in equal number. His hands were steady, his vision clear. He left the room, walked downstairs, and passed Nurse Marino in the breezeway. She wished him a good morning. He agreed it was beautiful. She said the storm had blown summer out for good. He leaned on the rail, breathing the fresh air, watching her walk away, enjoying the sway of her hips, maybe a sign of health. He walked into the compound, exchanged greetings with orderlies tossing a ball. He heard the ferry horn and saw Colley and the warden talking on the lawn. They nodded to him, and he nodded back. He sat on the hospital steps, feeling better than he had in a long time. A cigarette was offered. He took it, leaned into a Zippo's flame, smelling the gasoline. They exchanged pleasantries. He noticed Colley and the warden watching. He wondered if they'd ever figure out what was in the warden's book. Maybe they'd go to the grave without knowing. Perhaps some things weren't meant to be known. He took another pull, the tobacco sweet and rich. He asked what their next move was. Chuck told him to decide. He smiled at his partner in the morning sunlight. He said they needed to find a way off this rock, get home. Chuck agreed, said he'd need a minute to think. Teddy leaned back against the stairs, watching Chuck raise his hand and shake his head, acknowledging Colley's nod. Colley said something to the warden, and they crossed the lawn with 4 orderlies, one carrying a white bundle that caught the sun, metal glinting. Teddy wondered if they were onto them. Chuck shook his head, smiling in the sun. They were too smart for that. Teddy agreed they were, weren't they? The end. Thank you for spending this time on Shutter Island. What makes this story endure is not simply its mystery, but the questions it leaves behind. Long after the investigation ends, the novel asks us to confront something far more unsettling: whether truth is always something we want to face, and whether memory can be both a refuge and a prison. Beneath the suspense lies a meditation on grief, guilt, trauma, and identity. The island itself becomes a symbol of isolation, not just physical isolation, but the lonely distance that can grow between a person and their own reality. It is a story that invites different interpretations, which is why readers and viewers continue to debate its ending years later. When Martin Scorsese brought the novel to the screen in 2010, He approached it not as a conventional thriller, but as a psychological nightmare wrapped in the language of classic cinema. Leonardo DiCaprio delivered one of the most emotionally demanding performances of his career, while cinematographer Robert Richardson filled the film with dreamlike imagery that blurs the line between memory and truth. Music supervisor Robbie Robertson helped create the film's haunting atmosphere through an unconventional soundtrack built from modern classical pieces rather than a traditional score. The adaptation remained remarkably faithful to the novel's central story, though it leaned more heavily into visual symbolism and ambiguity. Small details hidden throughout the film reveal new meanings on repeat viewings, rewarding audiences who return to the island again and again. One fascinating aspect of the production is that many scenes were filmed at the historic Medfield State Hospital in Massachusetts, whose abandoned buildings helped create the unsettling feeling that the island itself was watching the characters. Scorsese also drew inspiration from classic psychological thrillers and Gothic films, weaving those influences into nearly every frame. If this story stayed with you, the original novel offers an even deeper journey into its characters and themes. Some emotions live differently on the page, and Dennis Lehane's writing allows those quieter moments to linger. And if you have your own interpretation of the ending, or if there was a moment that changed the way you saw the story, feel free to share it. These conversations are part of what keeps great stories alive. If you enjoy this retelling, subscribing, liking, or sharing it with another lover of stories helps us continue exploring remarkable worlds together. For now, the fog settles back over the island. The questions remain, and perhaps that is the point. Some stories are not meant to give us certainty. They are meant to stay with us, quietly, long after the final chapter is closed. Until the next story, thank you for listening.